Hello everyone, welcome to the Drydock episode 215. So this week, believe it or not, is back to Patreon questions because of course, illness, etc. delayed last month by a week and then had to spread it out over that week and the following week. So we're back here with the long form stuff again, but regular service hopefully should be resumed during October, so you won't have to put up with hours upon hours of me every week. You get back down to the hour Drydocks with any luck. Anyway, let's get on with things. Bill Luster asks, you mentioned in a recent Drydock that Norfolk had about 1,000 cannon in storage when it was captured by the Confederates. That sounds like quite a lot for a small navy, but I suppose they're only enough for a squadron of late ships of the line. How many naval guns would a major navy's primary base have in the same period? I.e., how many guns were in storage at Portsmouth about 1860, modern and otherwise? So it can be a little bit difficult to answer on a few grounds when you're talking about the 1860s. Firstly, when you talk about major navies, Royal Navy, French Navy, that kind of thing, one, they had multiple different major bases. So, in this time period, the Royal Navy's got Portsmouth, it's got Chatham, it's got Woolwich and Deptford are still around at this point. They only really start closing down when the ironclads get really big. Plymouth, and so on and so forth. So, for the Royal Navy, or the French, obviously, with Cherbourg, Brest, Toulon, and so on, they are distributing their fleet's armaments across a much wider spectrum than, say, the US Navy, which, especially at that point, Norfolk was the main base. They had other bases, but that's kind of where most of the stuff was stored. You had other stores elsewhere, but it was a lot more concentrated because there was a lot less of the US Navy compared to others. So that's one issue. Another issue, which is why this picture map is up, is that with the major navies, they also tended sometimes to separate out part of the base into a separate area, and that was entirely for arming and armaments. So this is a map of Gun Wharf Quays in Portsmouth as it was in the 18th century, and the reason it's called Gun Wharf Quays is because that's literally what it was. It was a wharf where ships loaded and unloaded their guns, and that was separate from the main Portsmouth naval base, which was just slightly further north. And if you see the video on Chatham Dockyard, which I did a little while ago, look at some of the older maps, you can see there as well they had a gun wharf or gun quay section that was slightly apart from the rest of the base, and this could lead to complications with trying to work out where things are, because the gun wharfs would have their own records and the base obviously would have its own records. They're kind of part of the same base, but also not quite. In large part it was because, well, A, lots of guns take up lots of space, and B, guns tend to be associated with ammunition, and people are generally taking the point of view of let's store all the big explosives at least half a mile away from the main naval base for the most part. And therefore you would have guns being offloaded off of ships or unloaded into ships in some element at the main naval base, but in large element at the gun wharfs. And then on top of that, so not only have you got distribution across the nation, and you've got distribution potentially across the world in the case of the colonial powers, and you've got distribution between the base and the dedicated armament storage areas. In the 1860s specifically, you also have a final complication, which is that guns themselves are getting larger. You've got, for example, in the Royal Navy, the 64-pounder instead of the 32 becoming the main armament of a lot of ships, and even bigger shell guns and so forth. And a lot of the newer ships, especially the ironclads, no longer have to load and offload their guns. So a ship that's coming into port for any kind of extended period in the age of sail would usually offload its armament, and that's in part why the gun wharfs were developed, to have a one-stop shop to do that and reload them. But as the 1860s go on, fewer and fewer ships in the Royal Navy, the Marine Nationale, etc., actually have to do so. And thus the gun wharfs become less and less useful for that purpose, because they're not offloading as many guns, and they tend to be therefore used for servicing older vessels, for more general storage of weaponry, and sort of become more of an ammunition dump than a armament storage area. And as the individual guns are larger, therefore you need fewer of them in the first place. And these ships quite often, sometimes will arm up in the main base for the first time, sometimes they'll arm up at the gun wharfs. So it again becomes very difficult to track things. So for example, the gun wharf quays itself, they kind of began to fall out of use in Portsmouth as the loading unloading area for ships armament actually in the mid 1850s. So it was already trending down by the 1860s. But we do know from records from around that period that visitors to the gun wharf quays area could see what the report describes as hundreds upon hundreds of naval guns. So we're probably talking somewhere in the region of 600 to 900 guns, so maybe slightly fewer than at Norfolk. But there's about 40,000 rounds and over 21,000 small arms of varying descriptions, which kind of shows where the shift has moved over to in gun wharf quay storage. Because, as you mentioned, even, let's say, take a mid-figure and say 750 cannon of varying descriptions, that is actually only the armament of, well, about 6 or 7, no, probably actually, given the 1850s, about 6 ships of the line, if that, or maybe 8 to 10 second or third rates, because I had 80 gunners and 90 gunners and so forth at that point. Plus, on top of that, you have to factor in that the Royal Navy in the 1860s and the Marine Nationale was very much an active navy. So they didn't have a particularly high proportion of their ships in reserve, and where they did have that large number of reserve vessels, they tended to be in secondary bases. So I suspect that if you look at where the Royal Navy tended to store its ships in ordinary, such as on the Medway, you might actually find that those gun wharfs actually had more guns in them than perhaps Portsmouth did, which was quite the active naval base. Conversely, in the run-up to the US Civil War, a very large number of US ships, including pretty much all their wooden ships of the line and a good chunk of their more modern frigates, were all in reserve or in ordinary in various forms. And so, proportional to the overall fleet, you would have had more guns in storage at Norfolk than perhaps you would have had at somewhere like Portsmouth. Chipster8253 asks, I've heard that different nations in the first half of the 20th century had significant differences in the quality of the armour plate used in warships in general, and capital ships in particular. Can you explain how a nation's steel manufacturing could be qualitatively different than another nation that's using the same process, e.g. Harvey, cemented, etc., etc.? Could you briefly tell us how the different nations ranked compared to each other, and did they improve compared to each other as the first half of the century came to a close? So this is something that really needs a detailed Wednesday video all of its own, and it will be an incredibly technical one. I am actually working on a script for it at the moment, but yeah, it involves a lot of phase diagrams and so forth. So be prepared for basically sitting through second year engineering materials lecture 101 on the various properties of steel when I get to that. But in terms of how the armour could be qualitatively different, at least once everyone had moved over notionally to Krupp steel, which is the armour for basically the entirety of the 20th century in the period the Channel covers, there's a wide variety of different factors that are involved for the end product, not all of which apply to all nations, which, that doesn't help in and of itself, but also, as you mentioned or indicated, they kind of change over time as well. So you have the basic quality of the initial ingredients, because obviously to start off, to make armor steel, you need iron. So how pure is your iron ore, and how good are your refining processes to turn that iron ore first into iron and then into steel. Okay, the Bessemer process has been around for a while, but different industries and different nations, one, they're starting off with different qualities of ore, and two, they have different capabilities. Then once you've got your steel of whatever quality it is, you've also got to account for very slight differences in how it's made in terms of the ratio of carbon to iron and so forth. They're not going to be exactly the same because these are to a certain degree proprietary secrets for the various manufacturers. And so, again, using arbitrary but ballpark arguments, if one nation is making armor grade steel and they're using, again, emphasis on the arbitrariness, 1.15% carbon, and another nation is using 1.18% carbon, then that is going to result in materially slightly different properties, which can affect things further down the line. And then, especially as you get into the interwar period in World War II, because to be fair, in World War I, most major nations' armour was kind of much for muchness. The variation between Japanese, American, British, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, German, French, etc. plate, for the most part, would probably lie within the majority of the bell curve of standard manufacturing variances. So there may be, a nation where their armour might, on average, be 2-3% slightly better than another, but that nation, could have a batch of material that was significantly worse than the nation that's on average slightly worse, and they might have a good batch going. But that's kind of a very generalized perspective. But then when you get, say, into the interwar World War II period, now you start talking about trace elements. Are you introducing chrome or chromium? Are you introducing molybdenum? Like, what other trace elements are you introducing at all? Also, that kind of leads back to the impurities thing from the beginning of what trace elements are left, not as well as what ones are you deliberately introducing, and that can make a difference to the final material outcome. And again, of course, proprietary trade secrets for the most part, so different people in different nations aren't necessarily going to realize what the others are doing. And then once you've got this new steel, well, steel is an alloy, but steel that has been alloyed with these trace elements, then you have to actually face harden it and cool it all down. And then that comes into, what machinery have you got? How capable is it of casting, rolling, hammering, whatever process you're using, manufacturing a plate of 12, 13, 15 inches thickness, and how well are you able to control the cooling process? To what depth are you face hardening the plate? Because you could have, the world's best, highest quality steel, and if you get the face hardening wrong, then someone that with what's theoretically, let's say, a 10% lesser quality steel, but who gets the face hardening depth right, might actually have a more resistive plate than you do. So all of these factors play into each other, and this leads to, the overall levels of who has what armor plate at what resistive values. Trevor Polasek asks, what kind of hand-to-hand combat training did Age of Sail sailors learn, and were they given instruction, or was it mostly self-taught? As with most things in Age of Sail navies, it starts off very chaotic and gradually becomes more formalised, and the officers usually get it before the sailors. So, for example, using the Royal Navy didn't get an official uniform cutlass drill until pretty much the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Everything before that had been at the discretion of either the fleet officers, the officers of the ship, or even sometimes officers in charge of particular decks, and going back up the scale, maybe squadrons. And they could be taught different systems, whereas obviously, as say, 1813, 1814, they brought in a universal one. But prior to that, officers would generally be expected to know how to fight with the sword as part of their station as an officer and a gentleman anyway, and they would receive some training from the Navy generally. Although, again, this depends on exactly when you're talking about. When the Navy had formalised schools set up, it was obviously much easier to train people, whereas if you were just joining ships left, right and centre, then that wasn't really going to be the case. But quite often the officers would have either received training before they joined the Navy, or they would have training paid for or pay for themselves, depending if their family was paying for it or they were, privately when they were off the ship, in order to learn how to handle whatever their weapon of choice was, because of course officers had a reasonable degree of choice in what weapons they had, although they were also expected to have a sword with them at any given time. And there are accounts of various ships' captains or the admiral of a fleet specifically ordering that the men be trained in hand-to-hand combat if, for example, they knew that they were heading off on a mission that was going to see them perhaps conducting landing operations, or if they thought there was a major fleet battle in the offing and perhaps a quick refresher in hand-to-hand combat was needed so that everybody could fight really well in boarding actions. But kind of like with gunnery, there was a recommended amount of practice, and then there was the practice that was actually done, and then there were captains who didn't particularly care, and then there were captains who would absolutely run the men through their paces, every other day or so. Plus, of course, for any kind of crew-based hand-to-hand training, you have to have an approximation of a widespread weapon or weapons within the crew. And that also, depends on the time in the Age of Sail, because especially towards the latter part of the Age of Sail, there could be standard issue weapons available in relatively large quantities, whereas perhaps at the beginning of the Age of Sail, if you vaguely want to call the classical Age of Sail sort of 16th century or so, people might have any one of a wide array of weapons. Someone might have a pike or a spear, someone else might have a hatchet or an axe, someone else might have a slightly bigger axe, someone might have a sword, a cutlass, and the sword could be in about 15 different forms. Someone else might just have some daggers. And when a boarding or counterboarding action is called for, someone might just pick up a lighter weight cannonball or a particularly large chunk of timber or something like that if they don't have anything else to hand. So, it starts off as very chaotic, apply object to man in front of you kind of stuff, gradually trending down to, the officers know how to fight well, then, we have some relatively standard weapons. We can perhaps start thinking about training the crew to, here is clear instruction across the fleet that everybody's going to follow. But by the time we get to that stage, at least in the Royal Navy, and broadly speaking for most of the other navies, you're kind of talking about the mid to late Napoleonic Wars and then the last 50 years of the Age of Sail. Warren Jervey asks, could you give us an update on the current open status of the Naval Museums, and if you have the time, museum ships you've previously profiled in the European countries? Specifically, is the museum or ship fully open, or are there significant restrictions on visiting? Now, obviously, check the museum's website before travelling to make sure exactly what days and times they're open, because not all museums are open 7 days a week, and not all museums are open kind of 9 to 5. Some are open, 10 till 4 on some days and 10 till 7 on other days, and so on and so forth. But in terms of whether or not they are open, pretty much every museum or museum ship I've been to in Europe, as far as I'm aware, is open now, without any kind of significant restrictions. Certainly Portsmouth Historic Dockyard is, SS Great Britain is, Chatham Dockyard, HMS Unicorn, although there are selected opening times for Unicorn, so please obviously definitely check that. Trincomalee, pretty much all the UK museums and museum ships are open, with the exception of HMS Caroline, which, as of the time of release of this video, as far as I'm aware, is still closed. But that's more to do with various spats between the NMRN, who own and operate Caroline, and the people who own and operate the dockyard that she's sitting in. But I won't go into that here. And in terms of Europe, again, as far as I'm aware, pretty much everything is open. Den Helder is open, Vasa is open. Those are the ones I've visited in Europe most recently, and I certainly haven't heard about any other museums that have failed to reopen or that have significant restrictions on people visiting. So, yeah, as far as I'm aware, with the exception of HMS Caroline, I think it's pretty much business as usual from pretty much all the museums and museum ships. The Golden Hind replica in London is also definitely open. They did a lot of work that during COVID lockdown, which actually ran over past lockdown, but as far as I'm aware from walking past on the way to HMS Belfast, they're definitely open as well. DJ Hurd asks, during the Washington and London naval treaties, could a shipyard build a ship as a proof of concept, i.e. not part of any navy? Yes, in theory, a shipyard could build a ship as a proof of concept and hope for a buyer. Such ships built on speculation had actually been done by a number of shipyards in the late 19th century, albeit that, by the 20s and 30s, the cost of building any kind of major warship had gone up quite considerably, so it would be far, far, far more of a risk to a shipyard to do so in that time period than it had been previously. Plus, also the market was somewhat dried up overall compared to the late 19th century when everyone was buying warships. But yeah, there was nothing to technically stop you from doing so. Bear in mind that Article 18 of the Washington Treaty, which has been broadly quoted as banning the sale of warships, technically doesn't. What it actually bans nations from doing is it bans specific nations from disposing of warships by gift, transfer, or sale. I.e., you can't have a ship and then instead of scrapping it, give it to someone who you might be very closely allied with. It doesn't actually prevent private shipyards in different nations from flat out building brand new warships for other powers, as indeed was the case. Various nations, minor nations, armed up with ships built in British, American, etc. yards during the interwar period. So yeah, it would be possible. Megascrow asks, turbo and superchargers were known from cars and aviation. Boilers and or funnels had draft aids, forced or induced, etc. Now, I came across a video on YouTube of a turbocharged wood burner. Could a turbo or supercharger be fitted on a ship's boiler? And if not, what would it take? And what would the result be? So there's two elements to, obviously, a ship's machinery. Assuming we're talking about steam turbine ships. Obviously, diesel engines, yeah, you can easily turbo or supercharge them. That's a fairly well understood concept. But when we're talking about the steam turbine, the ship's boilers, the forced or induced induction into the boiler rooms, that is actually a form of supercharging. Because, of course, supercharging is ramming a bunch more air in so that you get more combustion. There's basically forced draft. It's just that the forced draft on a ship is done on such a scale that you don't see a particularly specific piece of kit on most ships, although if you happen to go into something like Belfast or one of the Iowas, if you look in the right portion of the boiler rooms, you will actually see some rather large induction fans which are drawing the air in. So you could technically say they are probably the most visible part of a ship's supercharging system for the boilers. With a turbocharger, when you're recycling the fumes, that's probably not going to end well, considering that even with the best coal fuel initially and later on oil, you still have a fair number of particulates, and you don't really want to be shoving a lower oxygen, high particulate stream back into your boilers. The flip side is, of course, that when you transition over to the turbines, where the turbines are turning steam into rotational energy to move the propellers, the turbines technically all use a form of built-in turbocharging, because you have a high-pressure turbine and usually a low-pressure turbine, and normally the steam from the high-pressure turbine, once it's done its job and gone rotated however many blades, will go into the low-pressure turbine, and sometimes, occasionally, can even be recycled further back still, to get every last bit of energy out of it, because of course a turbine is a closed cycle system. for the most part. You're heating the water, you're turning it into steam, the steam is transferring the energy into the turbine, which goes to the propeller, and then the steam is cooled back down into water, which goes back to the boilers to be reheated, and so on and so forth, and round it goes. So, to get as much energy as humanly possible, you can kind of say a steam turbine ship that is using forced draft is actually using a supercharger in the boiler room and an inbuilt turbocharger in the turbine. John McDonough asks, I would like to know more about the life and times of Admiral Edward Vernon. I'm going to steal from Neil Gaiman and say that he appears to be a history vortex, from Grog to Rule Britannia to Mount Vernon to the eccentrically named War of Jenkins' Ear. There seems to be nothing in the mid-17th century that he wasn't involved in. He supposedly became a controversial MP after his naval service. How so? Well, Vernon is definitely someone who will at some point get a video of his own on Wednesday, but to very briefly summarise his career, you can look at his career from two main perspectives. In terms of his actual leadership, in terms of, fighting people and defeating fleets or capturing things, he has a very mixed record, actually. He captures a bunch of places and defeats some small squadrons and so forth. His capture of Portobello, as you mentioned, is kind of why we end up getting Rule Britannia, because it was a big celebratory moment. On the other hand, he had a fair few setbacks and defeats as well. The assault on Cartagena de Indias, which is definitely getting its own separate video at some point, being perhaps the biggest and most notable of them, and perhaps one of the biggest and most notable British defeats in that time period. So, yeah, you can say his combat record is mixed at best. On the other hand, his innovation and reforms aspect of his career, that was very successful. He's responsible for bringing in the watered-down rum ration, as the Royal Navy would have through the bulk of the Classic Age of Sail and, into the 1970s. He's also responsible... he was responsible for pressing continually for better training in ship manoeuvring as squadrons, for gunnery, etc. So he was probably you could say a significant reformist in a positive direction compared to a lot of his contemporaries, and I think that is more why he gets remembered these days, because of the changes that he made, not so much his combat record. As far as being an MP, well, he was an MP a couple of different times as far as I can recall, but getting to be an MP in 1700s England was not that difficult, to be perfectly honest. All you had to do was find a semi-rotten borough. And for those of you outside of the UK who may not be aware of that, basically the borough system, which was how England elected its MPs, and to a certain extent basically still does, even if the boundaries of the administrative and electoral boroughs are somewhat different these days, had basically been set, back when Parliament had first been founded. It had gone through one or two slight reforms since, but hadn't really changed for hundreds of years. The problem was the population pattern of Britain had changed quite significantly over those several hundred years. So, in Vernon's time, in the early to mid-1700s, going towards the latter part of the 1700s, it wasn't quite as bad, but it had got quite bad by the late 1700s and going into the early 1800s, because you could have areas where you say, there may not have been a town, say, in arbitrarily choosing a date, there may not have been a town at all in 1600, or there might have been like an inn, but for various reasons that might have grown into a town or a city of several tens of thousands of people. But because back when the last time constituencies were set, there had been nothing there was no MP, no Member of Parliament elected to represent that area. Conversely, you could have areas in other places where there had been a thriving town, and now there wasn't, for whatever reason. It could even have been the Black Death, going back that far. And so there might be a literal handful of people living in the area, And so if you wanted to be in Parliament and you had some money, which, let's face it, if you were an admiral in the Royal Navy, you probably did have a reasonable amount of money, then you could literally just buy yourself a seat in Parliament. One of the classics, Old Sarum, down in the southwest of England, by the time that borough was abolished, there were a grand total of, I think, about a dozen eligible voters. So you literally just had to, pay 7 of them to show up and vote for you, and that was it. You were in. And the constituency that Vernon first went into Parliament on, Penryn, had a couple of hundred eligible voters, plus on top of that, most of them would vote one way or the other depending on what the local patron lord said. So if you were buddy with him and maybe slipped him a few quid, then he would just tell the majority of people in Penryn, I would like you to vote for this person, and they would, and off he went to Parliament. So yeah. These days, if you want to buy your way to a seat in Parliament, you have to be slightly more covert about it. Robert Sokal asks, why was the German High Seas Fleet mutiny not met with deadly force from the military police and or whomever should be responsible for keeping order during wartime? As a counterpoint, the sailors' Kronstadt rebellion in Russia in 1921 during the Civil War was dealt with swiftly and decisively, allowing the Bolshevik government to stay in power. 3 broad reasons, basically. One, a good chunk of the military police and everyone else who was supposed to be keeping order either had sympathies with the mutinying sailors or was having a revolt, mutiny, etc. of their own. Secondly, a good chunk of the High Seas Fleet was moored slightly offshore, so they were getting to and from the shore via ships, boats and everything, which, if the sailors are the mutinying and they refuse to man the boat that's going to, or send the boat over to take the military police over to the ship, there's precious little anybody on shore who wants to correct them can actually do about it. And thirdly, with the sheer numbers and of course the fact they're all sailors aboard heavily armed warships, if they're as you can see here with this photo, if they're aboard their ships, truncheons, rifles and handcuffs are not going to cut it when they can just turn the ship's secondary battery on you. Plus, there were a couple of attempts to crack down on the mutiny. You've got to understand the mutiny in the High Seas Fleet kind of in some ways had 2 stages. There was a somewhat sporadic, relatively low number mutiny, numbering in the several hundreds, in direct response to the initial order to sail out and basically charge to a glorious death against the Grand Fleet. And that was almost suppressed, but then the method in which it was suppressed led to a wider outbreak of sympathies throughout the fleet, which led to a much larger general mutiny, both on the ships and on land in the naval barracks. As I said, there were some exchanges of fire, but it turns out the sailors were armed and knew how to shoot back. Plus, you had additional troops being brought in. The problem was, and this was kind of, as I mentioned before, the catalyst of a lot of the troops then joined the mutineers, and then that started to snowball into a much, much wider mutiny-rebellion, which ultimately was in significant part responsible for bringing down the German government towards the end of World War I. So, once you've got 40,000 mixed sailors, workers and soldiers all in the main German naval-based city, all mutinying, who are you going to get to impose order? The Judge 2017 asks, at USS Cassin Young, there's a bell from USS Boston CAG-1. Originally, she was designated CA-69. How was this change made to the bell? Was a new bell made when it was remade to say CAG-1? Now, I don't know the exact history behind this bell, but based on my general knowledge of ship's bells as a whole, it is entirely possible that when she was taken out of service, reworked and then recommissioned, obviously with a new designation, it may be entirely possible they made up a new bell for her at that point. But you've also got the fact that, a little known fact, bells wear out. Multiple bells can be issued to a particular ship during its lifetime. Obviously, it depends on the size of bell, how often it's used, so on and so forth, and also the type of material it's made out of. Some ships, for example, have silver bells, and silver bells are notable for actually wearing out a bit faster than the brass ones do, but brass ones can become corroded, pitted, cracked, just plain old worn, etc., etc. So whilst it's entirely possible that Boston recommissioned with a new bell because of her new designation, it's also entirely possible that she was sailing along with her old bell until at some point that bell needed replacing, and then she was issued a new bell with her new designation, well after recommissioning the CHE-1. As I said, I don't know the particular history, but those would be my suspicions as to how you ended up with a bell so named. Togfather asks, how much did the Royal Navy consider the qualities of an individual captain when choosing who to put in command of a ship? Did they try to put captains where they would fit best, or was it a case of HMS Defiance need a captain, who's next on the list? And Pellew, for example, seems to have been a born frigate captain, and the thought of him trapped on the quarterdeck of a third-rate on blockade duty outside some French port, desperately submitting proposals for raids and cutting out expeditions to his superiors, interspersed with occasional entreaties to the French in the harbour to come out and fight for the sake of his sanity, seems truly awful. So there were a whole mixture of factors. So I'm assuming by the context we're talking about the Age of Sail. So during the Age of Sail, you have a few different factors, I say, that come into things. You have the patronage of the particular officer in question. So if they've got very well connected patrons high up in the Navy, then that prospective captain might be able to write to those officers saying, well, you know what, I really, really would like a frigate, or I would really, really like to serve on a ship of the line, or whatever. And they may be able to influence things one way or another. Another thing that would be considered is the reports and recommendations of the admiral or captain or commodore or other ranking officers under which that officer was currently serving. So if the let's say the admiral of the squadron says, well, officer so-and-so, he is really, really good at commanding frigates, but to be perfectly honest, he's a little bit too energetic and jumpy to be being put on a ship of the line, well, then the lordships in the Admiralty might consider that. They might not necessarily agree. They might just go, well, there's an opening here, so off you go. But they would usually at least give some consideration to that. So if they say, all right, well, all his reports say he's a really good frigate officer, but terrible at sitting around on a ship of the line waiting, well, let's put him in a frigate that becomes available. And sometimes you might even have what might be viewed as a downgrade to enable that. So you might, say, be first lieutenant on a third rate, and you might really want a frigate captain assignment. Your patrons might be pushing for it, and your captain or admiral is saying, actually, yeah, this guy would do really well on a frigate. But if there's no frigate available, you might be given a brig or a sloop to command. So, you're not on anything like as large a ship, but you now are in command, and that lets you get command experience, which then means that when a frigate does become available, you can be moved up to a 5th rate or a 6th rate, and it basically, for the sake of appearances, it looks better than moving, say, the captain or the recently made captain of a 3rd rate down to a 5th rate or 6th rate. So yes, at least in theory, through a variety of measures, the Royal Navy in the Age of Sail would at least give some attempt to putting captains where they were best suited. But it would also sometimes be a case of maybe there were 2 commands available, and you might be suited for one, but someone with very powerful patrons might also want that command, so they get it, so you end up in perhaps the command you're less suited for. But also, it depends on your level of renown and fame, because if you make your reputation as an exceptionally good captain of a ship of the line or a frigate, you then have a much greater case yourself when time comes around for your promotion, to writing to the Admiralty directly yourself and saying, what, I would like, if it please their lordships, to be assigned to this or that ship which is in line with my current experience. which, amongst other things, is how Pellew managed to stay aboard Indefatigable for so long. Whereas if you were just, an okay but not particularly notable captain of a frigate, they might just bump you up to a third-rate captain on blockade duty as and when a slot became available, at which point you'd kind of have to either just sit there and hope that you could gradually get promoted to a second-rate or a first-rate over time, or if you are absolutely obsessed with getting back aboard frigates, you might be able to persuade the Admiralty later on to do so, but it would be seen within the Navy as something of a step down, because you're going from command position to command position, but your new command position has less fighting power, unless you manage to swing being Commodore of a frigate squadron or something like that. Oh, and don't forget temporary appointments of convenience, because especially looking at Nelson's career, you might be in command of a ship of the line, your ship of the line gets badly shot up, it has to go in for repairs, but they want you still on the front line. There's no other ship of the line to give you command of at the minute, so they might just stick you on a frigate for the moment and say, right, you command that basically until we can get something out there that's bigger and better for you to command. Or alternatively, it may be that, well, we want to reassign you from here to here, but your ship is needed at the first location, let's say third-rate ship of the line, fairly common command, and there's this other third-rate or second-rate or first-rate over on this other fleet which does need a commander, so we kind of want you to get over there, but we can't have you send you on your ship because that's too valuable in its current location, so we're going to temporarily move you from your rated ship of the line down to a frigate, and now your orders are to take this frigate from this location to that location, and then once you get to that location, we'll assign you the other ship. Miko Leitner asks, could Wallis's bouncing bombs theoretically be used against the Saint-Nazaire dock gates? They can blast right through dams made of solid concrete, so a dock gate should be fairly easy, right? Theoretically, yes. A bouncing bomb would, or several, would do quite the number to the Saint-Nazaire Drydock. I mean, bear in mind, Campbelltown's forward explosive, albeit it was not Torpex, which is what the bouncing bombs were filled with, but Campbelltown, quote unquote, only had a 4-ton warhead up front. The bouncing bombs have about 3 tons of Torpex in them, so explosive wise it's pretty much in the ballpark, and of course you can drop more of them. However, there are 3 main problems. One is there's an awful lot more anti-aircraft batteries around Saint-Nazaire in this time period than there is over the Murner, Ida and Sorp dams. So any Lancaster coming in would be subjected to an awful lot more anti-aircraft fire. Secondly comes difficulties in terrain and targeting. Because of the way the Saint-Nazaire dock is aligned, you would have to, if you're in Lancaster, you'd have to fly over land, over the southern coast of the harbour or estuary, and then drop down immediately for kind of a 2.5 mile run in, which would be a little bit difficult, especially if there turned out to be any anti-aircraft batteries in that area, but also just getting the alignment right generally. And of course the Saint-Nazaire dock gate itself is a considerably smaller target than an entire hydroelectric dam, so if you're off in your aim by even a fraction, you're just going to end up blowing up random bits of French dockside space rather than the gates themselves. And then finally, which is probably the single biggest problem with the concept as a whole, is that the Saint-Nazaire raid took place in early 1942, and in early 1942 the bouncing bomb was a theoretical weapon that hadn't even undergone any practical testing yet. So, in theory, possibly the other 2 issues could be overcome by being really fast and sneaky, but the last issue is the single biggest problem, because the Saint-Nazaire dock, as far as the Navy was concerned, needed to be blown up in early 42, not mid to late 43. Matt Blom asks, with the USS Texas recently dry docked for her $35 million repair, I found it difficult to find what work is specifically going to be done on her except for hull repairs and to make her more visitor friendly. Are you aware of the specific work details for her restoration? Yes, I am. As I mentioned in the live stream last week at the time that this is being released. I was at the HNSA, Historic Naval Ships Association conference earlier this month, and there was a whole presentation on exactly what the Battleship Texas Foundation is doing to repair Texas. So yeah, I'm fairly well aware of what they're going to be doing. Now, I don't want to necessarily steal their thunder, because they obviously put a lot of time and effort into doing that presentation, and they do have a rather nice active YouTube channel of their own. But if you want additional details beyond this answer, then please drop me a line, via Discord, via Patreon message or whatever, and I can see about getting one or more of the guys or girls from Battleship Texas Foundation onto the channel to talk about it, or perhaps, if they haven't done so already, putting more details on their YouTube channel. And by the way, shout out to all those people from Battleship Texas Foundation that I met while I was at the conference. Absolutely wonderful people. And commiserations for the iPad that cooked itself on its way with the ship to the dry dock. Turns out, trying to live stream from an iPad in the southern Texas heat kills iPads. Who knew? Anyway, so yeah, there's a fair bit of work to be done, as you can imagine. There are entire frames that need to be rebuilt. One of the bits of the presentation, which it was slightly difficult to tell if it was a comedy or a tragedy at that point, was Travis. If you've seen any of Battleship Texas Foundation's videos, you'll know who he is. Going, well, this frame doesn't exist anymore because it's rusted away. This frame's fallen over. There's half of this one left. This one's kind of here, but not really. It's more of a collection of rust that's pretending to be a frame, and so on and so forth. Which you're just sitting there going, and you felt confident enough to say all this. Wow, you're a braver man than I am. Fortunately, no, seriously, a lot of the frames were in the bilges and so forth, but not in the bilges, in the torpedo blisters, sorry. But still, it was, there's a lot of work to be done. So the superstructure needs strengthening and renovating. The main deck needs replacing and redoing. There's a lot of patches to be done on the hull. Obviously, the whole thing needs to be repainted and sprayed. There are areas where there is no more hull and there's just paint over it, which is part of what the jet washing that's been going on at the moment is revealing. And the torpedo blisters themselves are going to be completely reworked, because, well, you can see in the picture here, which was from the night it got out of the water, those torpedo blisters were added midway through the ship's life, and the geometry of them does not present any easy solutions for preservation. There are some areas in there that are very difficult to get to, and therefore very difficult to get preservation materials into, and that has a much wider ongoing effect because obviously if you get a hole in the bottom of the blister, that's just going to flood the rest of the blister even if it's intact, and secondly, rust can spread from a single point all over the place once it gets underneath the paint and other protective systems that are in place. So yeah, the blisters are going to be redone in a way that is going to still provide the necessary buoyancy that the ship needs, and also provide the appearance above the water that is needed to preserve the ship in the visual state that it's in at the moment. But the underwater profile of the blisters will be somewhat different to make it much easier to apply protection and coatings, etc. to it. But again, if I said, drop me a line if that's not enough, and if Battleship Texas hasn't put it up themselves, because there's a lot more to go into, but I would want to check with Battleship Texas Foundation that they're happy for me to say it here before I do so, because they may want to say it themselves, because after all, it is their ship. Nathapon Hong Sharon, I think, and again, if I'm mispronouncing your name so horrifically, please let me know, asks, how important was speed for battle line engagement other than running away? And for example, if the entire high seas fleet was 5 knots faster, what could she have done better at Jutland other than run away more successfully? So, assuming that the two battle lines are otherwise approximately equal, which obviously wasn't the case at Jutland, then speed of the battle line can have a couple of important factors. Firstly, if you're just in a straight up line engagement of, I say, roughly equal strength, then if one side has a 2-3 knot speed advantage over the other, then they can gradually overhaul the opponent's line and begin a crossing the T maneuver. Alternatively, they can prevent the enemy from leaving. So if you turn away more conventionally, perhaps, than Scheer did, then you can keep up with them even though you're going on the wider outside curve, and basically punish them for trying to leave, and maybe even force them to stay in contact continuously. Plus, remember, when these line engagements occur, it should be presaged by a bunch of cruiser and destroyer engagements from your fleet screens, maybe even battle cruisers, at which point, if you have a speed advantage, then assuming that your scouting elements are doing their job properly and telling you where the opponent is and what their course and speed is, you can maneuver yourself for a place of best advantage. So even if the initial picture that's developing shows that you might be at a disadvantage positioning wise, if your battle line is faster, then you can get into another position quicker, which means you can then dictate how the initial engagement starts, because you can then press to start from a position of best advantage for yourself. It also means if things start to go badly for you, you can withdraw without the enemy being really able to close you down, which is always helpful as well. It also prevents your fleet becoming strung out, which is one of the things you see at Jutland, where the initial clash between the High Seas Fleet and the Grand Fleet is probably more properly described as the remnants of First Scouting Group plus the Kaisers and Koenigs fighting the Grand Fleet, because the Helgolands, Nassau's and Deutschlands were all strung out in quite a distance behind as they were struggling to catch up. So yeah, it is quite important in a battle line of equals, with the flip side being that if the battle line is completely unequal in terms of who has how many ships and how much firepower, then, to be perfectly honest, any reasonable speed advantage you might have probably isn't going to save you. Albeit that being slower than your opponent might doom you, because if you are both outnumbered and outsped, then you can't run away. Christian B asks, if Commodore Bonte receives early notice that Warspite is coming to Narvik and his instructions are to sink Warspite at all costs, can he do it? Is he better off leaving the fjord and going to the open sea, or should he try to stay hidden? And how would his chances change if the German torpedoes actually worked as intended? Now, see, that's kind of the key thing, because if the German torpedoes are actually functioning as they're supposed to, then he doesn't really have to do anything. He just has to wait for Warspite to show up, and one of the 2 or 3 U-boats that took pot shots at it will tag Warspite on its way into the fjord. If, on the other hand, the torpedoes aren't working as intended, well, obviously then the U-boats will have the torpedo failures that they did historically, and as we know from the Second Battle of Narvik, when Warburton Lee's destroyers went in, the German torpedoes were running far too deep as well. So if he tries, okay, Warspite does draw a little bit more water than an H-class destroyer, but we're talking some serious deep running issues here. So, if he went out to sea, no, that would probably be suicide, because Warspite, when she goes into Narvik, she has a very strong destroyer screen. There's a cruiser or 2 offshore as well. So if the Germans go out and try an open sea battle, they'll be mobbed by various, tribal and K and H class destroyers. Plus Warspite's fire at long range, and Warspite's got all the sea room to maneuver. If he has to sink Warspite at all costs, that leaves him with the fjord, and then he has a bit of a problem because, of course, as this photo indicates, Warspite used her scout aircraft to do some forward reconnaissance, which is how they knew one of the German destroyers was waiting for them round one of the corners, and was then able to deal with that. And again, Warspite has its very strong screen, but it is in more confined waters. So if if you're going to do anything to get Warspite sunk with the collection of destroyers the Germans have left, then probably what you want to do is find a convenient corner or side fjord to hide down, force the British to come as close as possible, and then just boil out en masse and just headlong charge and try and get point blank torpedo shots. Sure, you'll lose most of them, but you only need to get one spread correct for there to be major problems. But, again, this is assuming that the German torpedoes are working properly, because they may not, and if they don't, then you have problems. But, as I said, if they do work, then that strategy will work. If the German torpedoes aren't working, you'll probably just, lead to the end of the German destroyers much more quickly. And, of course, you have the kind of hit and miss nature of malfunctioning torpedoes, because, the H-class managed to survive a bunch of torpedoes that went straight under them. Warspite had a bunch of torpedoes fired at it that either didn't work or exploded prematurely, but conversely Eskimo goes into the end of the fjord and gets its bow blown off. So, it's complete roll of the dice as to which torpedoes are going to work or not. Bill Brockman asks, my grandfather was on the armoured cruiser USS North Carolina in World War I. I think they mostly escorted convoys. Is there anything the Germans could have feasibly threatened her with other than a U-boat? By the time the US Navy was involved in World War I escorting convoys, no. The Germans had precisely one vaguely modern armoured cruiser left by that point, the SMS Rune, and, she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. All of the German surface raiders had basically been taken out by that point, and as I said, they only had one armoured cruiser that could break 20 knots still left on their fleet list, at which point the only thing that was going to plausibly threaten North Carolina outside of, as you mentioned, a U-boat torpedo would be if, for whatever reason, the Germans decided to go complete radio silence and launch one of their remaining battle cruisers into a Bismarck-style commerce raid attempt, which would probably not end well at all. It would probably be over a lot faster than Bismarck's breakout was. Pretty safe from surface actions in a nice chunky armoured cruiser towards the latter part of the war if you're in the Atlantic. Again, as you said, at least unless you're talking about torpedoes. Hi, Bacon Bomb asks, why were the Kongos seen as such a threat to other nations, and in your opinion, what nation built the best looking ships? So the Kongos were seen as a major threat for, if you divide into kind of two periods, World War I and then the interwar, early World War II period. During World War I, they were seen as threats because they were, at least until the advent of Hood, technically the most heavily armed battle cruisers in the world, and quite quick as well, which made them very scary as long as, at least in the context of 13.5-14-inch armed battle cruisers, you didn't look too closely at their armour. Although, then again, if you're fighting against 11-inch armed ships at longer ranges, that armour might just about have been adequate. Nonetheless, once you move into the interwar period, especially once they start getting modernised, prior to the fast battleships coming online, and bear in mind that the King George V's and the North Carolinas don't actually start coming online till right at the end of the 1930s, or in some cases, depending on exactly which ship you're looking at, even into the 1940s. So during that entire 1930s period, the Kongos are the single largest class of fast warships that any of the big nations have. The US doesn't have any fast capital ships until North Carolina comes online, and the British have three. They have Hood, Renown, and Repulse, and you can argue that, yes, Hood is superior to a Kongo, but there's only one of Hood, and Renown and Repulse, you can make arguments like 6 or 1/2 dozen of the other on which is the better ship, because the Kongos have an extra pair of guns, but they're slightly smaller guns. The belt armour on the Kongos is fractionally thinner, but does it really matter in a matchup with 15 and 14-inch guns? Probably not. And, there is Renown and Repulse are two ships, and the Kongos being operated by the Japanese. In theory, if they can arrange for all 4 of them to be in service at once, they can deploy all 4 of them to a particular location. The British can't guarantee that Renown, Repulse and Hood are all going to be in service at once, and they also can't guarantee that they're all going to be in the same place to fight the Kongos. And they'd still be a one-ship disadvantage. And the speed margin between the Kongos and anybody else's other capital ships that aren't Renown, Repulse and Hood, at least we're talking about the 3 big powers, because obviously you have Dunkirk and Strasbourg and so forth, but anyway, the speed margin is considerable, and it's also the Kongos have the high enough speed that they can conceivably catch, chase down carriers, which most battleships can't do. And especially in the Pacific War, where the carriers are expected to be sailing around purely with cruiser escorts, at least in the US Navy's case, that's quite the worry. You don't want one of potentially 4 very fast, heavily armed ships rolling up over the horizon with enough armour to withstand 8-inch gunfire quite comfortably at long ranges, at least, and just plinking away at your carriers, considering that all the fleet problems had shown that if the carrier gets in range of a capital ship, it's dead unless it can run away very fast, and against a Kongo it can't run away very fast. So that's why the Kongos are seen as such a threat, because they can, in the reduced fleet numbers of the interwar period, they can fulfill in a lot of ways the original battle cruiser mission, and with that mission extended to also finding and killing carriers. Now, as far as which nation built the best looking ships, I think to a certain extent that's an impossible question, because a lot of it comes down to aesthetic value in the eye of the beholder. Now, I know you said my opinion, but my answer may be seen as completely invalid by somebody else purely because they don't like the aesthetic of the ship that I name. So some people really hate the look of Nelson and Rodney. I kind of like the look of Nelson and Rodney, although I admit there are angles at which they don't look particularly good. Some people like the Queen Anne's Mansions, period, including myself. Other people hate them. And as you know, I have a soft spot for various ships from various nations, including one of my personal favourites, the New Mexico class. So, it's like, if you ask me what's got the better aesthetic, Richelieu, Hood, or New Mexico, I'd be looking for the nearest exit, because they're all incredibly attractive ships in different ways. And different nations go through different periods of design, where sometimes they come up with really good looking stuff, and sometimes the stuff they come up with looks absolutely horrific. The French, for example, basically, in the Age of Sail, the French turn out some of the most beautiful looking warships of that time period. And then in the early ironclad era, while you wouldn't necessarily describe them as beautiful, they do at least turn out a few interesting ones, like the 2-decker ironclads. And then it all goes a little bit pear-shaped, to say the least, in the later ironclad period, pretty much through their entire pre-dreadnought period, although there is something to be said, I guess, for the Dantons. But broadly speaking, the French seem to just lose all sense of aesthetics for about 50 years, until suddenly, with the Dunkirks and the Richelieus, it's like somebody's trying to make up for the past 50 years and designing some absolutely beautiful looking ships. And kind of the same with the Royal Navy. Although the Royal Navy doesn't have quite the extreme swings that the Marine Nationale does, there are some periods where Royal Navy ships look really nice, and other periods, like the Counties, at least to my mind, look really nice. And there are other periods where it's kind of, you've made generic warship. It's not bad looking, but it's unless you've got an eye for it, they kind of just look, like I said, generic warship number 1 and 2 and 24 and so forth. So yeah, I think if you wanted me to pick out which nation was building the best looking ships in particular decades or particular periods, that could be done. But I think almost every nation has built some really, really nice looking warships at times, and at other times has built some real eyesores. Daniel Silverthorne asks, how did ships recognise which ship was which during the Age of Sail? Were there recognition guides or lists of pennant numbers and such used to identify such ships? And outside of national ensigns, what prevented one ship from pretending to be something it was not? Or is that why the rules of war dictated that hoisting false colours was to be treated with utmost disgrace? And if such listings of ships existed, what information did they identify about the ships included? And would they have been only for friendly ships, or would they also include any known details on enemy ships? Well, there wasn't anything like, the ONI ship recognition cards or whatever in the Age of Sail. Some captains kept books or notes and so forth that gave general ideas, but a lot of it was just learned via experience. And it also depended on what range you were at, because there were certain national characteristics on ships, like the design of the stern, for example, or the particular way rig was set, which you could use as a general rule of thumb, that, okay, this ship is probably a Frenchman, this ship's probably a Spanish, this one's probably English or British, depending on the time period, etc., etc. But this is one of the reasons why, big national ensigns were necessary, and as you said, one of the many reasons why hoisting a fake flag was considered to be really bad. You had to have your proper national ensign before you went into action, otherwise you could be treated very, very poorly indeed. But a lot of it was also just down to recognition factors. Certain designs of ship would sail in certain ways. One of the fundamental problems with the Age of Sail was, especially when you consider the Royal Navy, but this applied to a lesser extent to other navies as well, was that even if you had the perfect way of telling apart, a Tonnant class ship of the line from a Swiftsure class ship of the line, that may not matter, because there may be a bunch of Tonnant class in the Royal Navy that they've captured, and the French captured Swiftsure, or one of them. So, you looking at it and go, oh yeah, well that's a Swiftsure class, therefore it must be friendly. Well, actually that might be the French one. And equally, if you're a French captain, you say, oh yeah, well that squadron of 3 coming over the horizon, that's Tonnant class, so they're friendly. Well, no, they might actually be British at this stage. This is one of the reasons why hull colour painting came into vogue. Initially, it was done on kind of a squadron or fleet basis, but then as the Napoleonic Wars ground on, obviously the British adopted what they call the Nelson checker, which is what you see HMS Victory in, and a little bit thereafter, the Spanish and French fleets also began to adopt national colours to help identify ships by their hull colour, when, an ensign might be hidden in the smoke, or have been blown away, or badly torn, or the wind might not be up, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the time it involves seeing sails on the horizon, and if you weren't expecting sails on the horizon, you would just, both sides would either try and gradually edge closer to each other, or if they weren't certain of the identity and one side was significantly bigger than the other, you'd veer away. But if you were closing, then, as I said, you'd start to look for certain characteristics like number of gun ports, paint, structural details like the stern, maybe the uniforms people were wearing, the rig of the ship, what kind of sails they were using, etc. If you couldn't see any flags, and so on and so forth. And you'd gradually put all of these together and come up with a tentative identification. But there were still, periods even during war where 2 ships would get to within cannon shot of each other, and one would hail the other to figure out who was who, and they would turn out, oh, actually, you're the enemy. Right, I guess we have to fight each other now. Recognising big fleets was somewhat easier, because if you were in a big fleet, unless you'd received rather explicit orders from afar, chances were if another big fleet showed up on the horizon, it probably wasn't friendly. Matt Kidd asks, how slow could an interwar battle line go and still be effective? Were the US standard classes pushing the lower limit? In part, it depends on whose battle line you're talking about, but as a rule of thumb, yeah, the US standards were probably pushing the lower limit, i.e. 21 knots, for a battle line, obviously assuming they're making their original design speed, which some of the ships weren't necessarily doing, because a lot of it depends on the fact that if you're taking your full battle line out, which if you're a major navy, you're going to be taking, either the full line or most of it. A lot of it depends, this is kind of related to the earlier question on speed, on what is the speed of your slowest ship or ships, because that's what you're probably going to end up being tied to. If you're going into a full battle, you can't really afford to leave a number of capital ships behind just because they might be a bit slower than the rest of them. So, if the US line is all going 21 knots because they're all standards, well, the Japanese battle lines their speed's going to be dominated by the Fuso and Issei's 23 knot top speed. Again, we're assuming that everybody is making their original design speed, and the British are going to be in the same boat because the R's are also 23 knot ships. So the Japanese and the British both have theoretically 23 knot battle lines. If the Japanese drop the Fusos and Issei's, yes, they can get a battle line that's now over 25 knots because they have the Nagatos and Kongos, but they only now have 6 ships. If the British drop the R's, again, we're assuming that everybody's putting all their ships out to sea. It's an artificial scenario, I know, but just run with it. Then if they drop the R's, then they have the QEs and the Nelsons and Hood, Renown and Repulse, but the Nelsons are also 23 knot ships. So if the British want to drag their battle line above 23 knots, they have to also leave the Nelsons behind. So once they've left the Nelsons and the R's behind, they have 8 ships: Renown, Repulse, Hood, and the 5 QEs, and they've only improved their battle line speed by about a knot and a bit. So the British really aren't going to be leaving anyone behind. So you can say, right, the British battle line is locked at 23 knots. The Japanese battle line is probably also locked at 23 knots because although they can theoretically go faster, it's going to leave them with 6 ships versus 15, which is not a winning combination. So the US in some ways can get away with having a slightly lower speed because the difference between 23 and 21 knots is not as great. I've said before, kind of rule of thumb, you kind of need a 3 knot speed advantage for it to really make a major difference. A 2 knot speed advantage, it might make a difference, but clever manoeuvring might be able to overcome that. And also, as I said, it depends on the size of your fleet because, again, assuming that everyone's got all their ships out, if the US has 15 capital ships heading towards you, yes, they may not be going quite as fast as yours, but you still have to get in the way of them to stop them, which to a certain degree negates any marginal speed advantage you might have. Whereas if the situation was flipped on its head and, say, the US battle line had a minimum 23 knot speed, and by dropping 4 ships, i.e. still having 11 left, could get up to 25, 26 knots. So we're kind of flipping the capabilities of the Japanese and the US around, and the Japanese have a purely 21 knot battle line. Then, although it's the same speed as your standard battle line is in real life, then the Japanese are in serious trouble because they've got 10 ships capable of 21 knots. If the US can rock up with 11 ships capable of 25 plus, then that's a decisive speed advantage for them to use, and they still have a slight numerical superiority, and the slower ships can try and catch up or whatever. Whereas, say, the flip side, the other way around, you have to fight the US fleet regardless. So yeah, 21 knots is about as low as you can push it, but you need a big navy. If you're going to be the slowest navy on the field, you better hope you're the biggest navy on the field. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, how does one calculate the turning radius of a ship that wasn't built, such as the G3? It depends if you're talking about these days or back then. These days, you build a digital model, stick it in a computer program, and hit run, and it just goes. And then that will tell you the results. Back in those days, however, it was possible to do, or at least it was possible to estimate the turning radius. Sometimes the calculations were a little bit wrong, but most of the time they're mostly on par. And you could do it by looking at the basically a lot of the calculations and formulas and measurements that had been taken to help work out the estimated speed for the given power requirements. So you do look at things like the total wetted area, the waterline length, and the the whole underwater hull forming, the tank tests that would usually be undertaken by the point you're talking about something like the G3s, the rudder size, the amount of power that you're going to put in the rudder, where the propellers were, what the lines of thrust of the propellers were, and how that would interact with the rudders. And then you could plug in all of those results and figures into a set of calculations, which would take quite a while to work out, but that would give you turning forces and moments and amounts of resistance and so forth, and that would then give you a curve or a radius, which would hopefully be roughly how much it would take you to turn. But obviously that would only be an indication, because you'd have to set everything up right at the beginning for things like the speed of the ship, for example. Whereas these days you can have all of those and, as I say, get a computer to work it out for you very quickly. Back in those days you'd have to go through quite a long series of calculations, and if you wanted to know the turning radius at all sorts of different speeds, you'd have to do that for each speed separately, which would be a bit frustrating. So they tended to calculate turning radii for maybe 3 speeds, if that. Top speed, cruising speed, and maybe steerage speed, i.e. coming into port and so forth. And even then, as I said, there were surprises about ships handling and turning radius, etc., when they actually got into service, but it was a lot less common than the calculations being roughly on the money. And this is why the US standards, for example, they could specify in the design that they should all have the same turning radius. That wasn't something that you could adjust once the ships were in service. You had to be able to calculate through and say, right, well, this ship is much larger, has more powerful engines and a slightly different hull form to this ship we built 3 years ago, but it's going to have the same turning radius because, and then you throw a phone book size packet of equations at somebody and hope that they shut up and listen. MSSB asks, is there any books or other sources of information regarding the deployment-location of Imperial Japanese Navy ships around late June to early July 1939? Well, if you're looking for specific ships, the Combined Fleet website has a huge number of tabular records of movement for Imperial Japanese Navy ships. Now, granted, they become an awful lot more detailed during the Second World War, but if you're looking for certain ships, then there's a reasonable chance that their manoeuvres in 1939 will also be there, so you can look those up. Beyond that, most of the rest is going to be, I hope you read Japanese, because that's where a lot of the information can be found. There is a fair bit of information available about the Imperial Japanese Navy in Japanese that just has not made it through into English literature. So, yeah, unfortunately, if you don't read Japanese, that may be a bit of a problem. But one of the other things you can do is also construct records of movement for ships, even if you don't necessarily have the tabular record data for every single ship. So, for example, if you know that a given cruiser is on that particular month that you're looking for, if you know where it is, and you know that that cruiser is part of a specific cruiser division, then you can look at the other cruisers, and even if you don't have exact details of the other cruisers available, if there's no information indicating that any of those cruisers were indisposed in a shipyard under repairs or something, then you can make a reasonably safe bet that those other cruisers were with the one whose record you do know about, assuming that you can confirm that that cruiser division was operating together at the time, and so on and so forth. So yeah, apologies for that, but it does get a lot clearer once the war begins. But there is a little bit of a lull in Japanese activity anyway in summer 1939. So, immediately prior to that, the location of a lot of carriers is off of China, supporting the Sino-Japanese War latest edition. But, mid-1939, a lot of the stuff is back in Japan. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, which set of 2 or 3 sister ships were the most dissimilar or unalike? And also, is there a Royal Navy equivalent to the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships? So, as far as the comprehensive sort of summary histories of almost every single ship that's ever flown the Stars and Stripes that is DANFS, or DANFS, I guess as you call it, I'm not aware of a British equivalent. Certainly, for one thing, if you did that for every single ship that's flown the White Ensign or equivalent thereof, it would be a huge undertaking given how old the Royal Navy is and how many ships they've had in the past. But even in terms of, late 19th century onwards, I'm not aware of a single collated resource that has that kind of depth of detail for, as I said, practically every Royal Navy ship under the sun. I'm sure someone would love there to be, but yeah, there are books that give incredibly detailed operational histories of a type of Royal Navy ship. So, for example, R.A. Burt's books on British battleships give really comprehensive operational details for the battleships that roughly correspond to the period that DANFS covers for the US. But that's a series of books and only covers battleships. There's, you've got the carriers, you've got cruisers and destroyers, blah, 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 etc. So yeah, I'm not aware of one. If there is one and I've somehow missed it, I'm really going to kick myself. Now, as far as which set of 2 or 3 sister ships are most dissimilar or unalike, well, as long as you can still vaguely call them sister ships, there's a few candidates that come to mind, but the Hipper class certainly would be up there. I mean, there's a difference in length of about 25 foot and displacement of about 1,500 tons between Hipper and the last Hipper class for which we have any kind of reasonable details, that being Seydlitz and Lutzow. Prince Eugen is still, longer and heavier than Hipper, and, Blücher is shorter and lighter than Prince Eugen, but longer and heavier than Hipper. So, yeah, there's a fair degree of variation there. I mean, the problem is once you start to get significant variation, do they really become sister ships or are they half sisters? Because technically speaking, Furious is part of a set with Courageous and Glorious, but a lot of the time you'll see the Courageous class listed as Courageous and Glorious, and Furious kind of either off on the side as a one-off or as a half-sister because of the radical change in armament apart from anything else. So I think a lot of it is, where are you prepared to draw the line at when it comes to what constitutes a sister ship? I mean, if you really want to throw things out there for complete, differences in visual profile and so forth, you could look at the ostensible Charles Martel class pre-dreadnoughts of France. In theory, they were supposed to be a single class. In practice, if you look at Charles Martel, Carnot, the unpronounceable one, Bouvet and Massena, with some of them you'd be hard-pressed to cite immediate evidence that they even came from the same nation, let alone the same class. But most people, tend to split them off into a bunch of single ships and go, yeah, they're a nice idea, but not sister ships. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, in your opinion, how do Russian and Soviet warships compare to their contemporaries? Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of history covered in Russian and Soviet warships, even if we just limit ourselves to the period that the channel covers up to 1950. And things vary quite a lot during that time, because you could look at, say, Peter the Great's navy fighting the Swedes in the Baltic. That navy is, pretty darn capable for the area of operations it's in. Yes, it's not a fully going oceanic navy, but it's not designed to be. It's designed to contest the Baltic. Russian ships of the line in the Age of Sail, they can be a little bit hit or miss, depending on the exact time period. Some of them can look really fearsome on paper and actually turn out to have horrible sailing qualities. Others were reasonably good, and of course you have some really big Russian ships showing up for the Sinop with shell guns when they're still relatively new and innovative. So, but then you get into, if you want to broadly call it, the period of ironclads, and things are all over the shop. You've got some stuff that gets laid down and is, again, on paper and potentially also in practice, high performance enough that, big navies like the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale sitting up and going, we better build a response to this because this is scaring us. But equally, you have other ships, especially anything that Admiral, I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's Shestakov or Shevastikov. Almost anything he touches turns into an overloaded and bloated mess, and everything in between. And then when you get to, onto slightly firmer ground, into the pre-dreadnought era, and then into the dreadnought era, I think if I was going to characterize Russian developments as a whole from maybe 1890 onwards, I would say they usually, outside of things like the mess that was the development of the Kirov class's guns in the 1930s, but they usually come up with something that's pretty decent, except they usually end up coming up with it about 3 or 4 years after everybody else, or something gets horrifically delayed, it's a bit of a slam your head into a brick wall, quite a bit. Because for example, look at the Gangut class. So they are, they're built with some pretty powerful guns, and this is one of the things you'll constantly find, I think, with Russian and Soviet warships, at least in the pre-dreadnought and dreadnought era. They'll usually be something notable to write home about for them, but it ends up being concealed in a bunch of other stuff. So, 12-gun broadside dreadnought is, it's Russia's first dreadnought, but by on-paper specs, without looking into, the precise details of the guns and so forth, which is, say, a fairly high power in this case, Gangut would fall broadly into the second-generation dreadnought category. And with a 12-gun broadside of very powerful guns, admittedly, a pretty decent turn of speed, and her armor's a little bit subpar, but some of the successors, like the Imperatrice Maria variants, have okay-ish armor. If Gangut was competing with Colossus, Hercules, the Helgolands, the Floridas, etc., in that kind of second-generation dreadnought phase, she'd be a fairly competitive ship. But they don't commission until 1914, 1915, at which point their immediate contemporaries are the last of the first-generation super dreadnoughts and the first of the second-generation super dreadnoughts. Or you can look at their last class of pre-dreadnoughts, which I'm probably going to horribly butcher the name of, the Andrei Pervozvany class. Again, on paper, armor is a little bit thin. Speed's alright, though. Main armament's perfectly fine, and their secondary battery, they are kind of true semi-dreadnoughts. They've got a lot of 8-inch guns, and most of them are even turreted. In fact, a bunch of them are twin-turreted, so there's relatively advanced, decent thinking design. And when you compare it to the Royal Navy's sort of semi-dreadnought, the Lord Nelsons, the Lord Nelsons have 9.2-inch guns, not quite as many of them, but the Lord Nelsons start construction in 1905. The Andres, as I'm going to call them for the minute, start construction almost, on average, about a year earlier. So the Russians are a little bit ahead of the curve on this, except that even with the delays caused by Dreadnought nicking all of their main guns, Lord Nelson and Agamemnon are commissioned in 1908 and probably would have been commissioned a year or maybe even 2 earlier had Dreadnought not nicked the guns. Whereas, the Russian one, they didn't enter service till 1911, which is when first-gen super dreadnoughts are entering service. So, again, if they'd been coming into service 1906, 1907, people will be going, oh yeah, the Russians were quite up with it with the semi-dreadnought designs. Not when they're coming into service in 1911, they're not, though. And this kind of characterizes pretty much most Russian warships. Donovan asks, in the movie Below, a suspense-haunting film taking place on a US sub in the Atlantic during World War II, one of the antagonists is a German destroyer with either drag or trolley hooks or trawler hooks for an anti-submarine weapon. I figure it's plot for the movie, but why would a destroyer have something like that? My guess is it's minesweeping equipment. So chalk up another film that I haven't seen, but going by your description, yeah, I mean, obviously, using some hooks on the ends of chains or ropes to try and drag a submarine, it sounds like something that was written into the suggestions box in 1914, 1915 when the Royal Navy was trying to think of anti-submarine warfare tactics, right up there with the send men out with a boat and a small hammer to break the periscope glass kind of stuff. But why would a destroyer have something like that aboard? Yeah, minesweeping gear would be one guess, but they didn't tend to use hooks for that. Paravanes, some sort of paravanes lost in translation might be my guess, because those are minesweeping gear that a destroyer might well have aboard, and could act like some kind of drag sweep or trawler sweep that might entangle a submarine. The other thing, the only thing I can think of that a World War II destroyer might plausibly have aboard for some reason that would act as a specific drag hook of some, just again, I haven't seen the movie, just going by the description of the question, might be if the destroyer was fitted with equipment to go hunting for underwater telegraph cables to cut. Now, cutting the telegraph cables wasn't as much of a strategic advantage as it would have been in the First World War, where the British did it with great aplomb, but it would be a significant inconvenience if you could pull it off. So maybe they had that, and that was running for whatever reason. The Freaker 86 asks, when battle stations are called on a US Navy ship, the crew, if I remember correctly, runs on the starboard side toward the front of the ship, and if necessary up the ladder, and on the port towards the rear, and if necessary down the ladder. How did the Royal Navy and Kriegsmarine crews execute manning battle stations in an orderly manner? Honestly, this is one of those issues where I don't know the fine detail. So maybe other people listening to this do know and can supply the answer in the comments. I do know that one of the major issues, at least in the early to mid part of World War II, was that US Navy ships kind of had to have this system in place, if for no other reason than the crew's duty stations when they weren't at battle stations tended to be quite considerable distances away from their actual battle station. So they had to have a very formalized system of getting to and from places, because crews sometimes had to run most of the length of the ship. Whereas it was noted, and came out in First Savo Island, for example, that Royal Navy ships, or ships trained along the lines of the Royal Navy, like the Australian Navy, tended to have men having their duty stations either also be, in the Royal Navy's case, their action station, or to be stationed near to that action station. So there wasn't quite the same mass movement of crew when action stations were sounded on a Royal Navy ship, and so there would have been slightly less need for this kind of system. But I do know they did still have a system, and I do remember reading accounts of Royal Navy sailors where they describe going into action stations, and they say, this ladder was for going up through the ship, this ladder was for going down through the ship, and so on and so forth. But in terms of exactly what system was in place for the Royal Navy or the Kriegsmarine, unfortunately, you managed to hit an area where I just flat out don't know. So if anyone else does know, please let us know in the comments, because then we can all learn something. Avoid Shisnos asks, during the Age of Sail after large battles, was there a need to form convoys for captured or damaged ships, or were they just sailed back under the guns of the fleet itself? It kind of depends what kind of battle had been fought. If you fought a more traditional Age of Sail battle, then there might be a winner and a loser, but both fleets might be substantially intact, at which point, if a ship, whether it be captured or friendly, was badly damaged, it would just be towed by one of the ships in the fleet, and the fleet would sail off as a body. If it was a captured ship and it wasn't too badly damaged, then it would be sailed by the prize crew, again with the main body of the fleet, and the main body of the fleet would serve to guard them. So you might put the damaged ships and any ships doing tows, depending on how things had gone, you might put them to the other side of your formation relative to where the enemy fleet is. At other times, if you are the losing fleet and you're retreating, you might tow some of your damaged ships with you, but obviously it's not quite every man for himself, but almost. And so a lot of those damaged ships would end up towards the rear of the fleet, and if the enemy fleet decided to pick up the pursuit, then sometimes those damaged ships would be cut loose, and then they'd be overwhelmed and captured, which kind of had a dual role thing, because it meant the towing ship could now move faster, and it also meant, in theory, the leading and therefore fastest elements of the enemy fleet could sometimes end up getting caught up, capturing this damaged vessel if they weren't smart. The smart ones would just let that damaged vessel fall past and let some of the slower ships pick it up, and then rely on, well, we were nearby for the prize money claim, which was definitely a thing. Other times, the towing ship might actually just stand there and fight. It might be a hopeless battle, but they might actually, stand by their damaged compatriot and fight it out until both were overwhelmed, which was very honourable, if not necessarily the world's most sensible thing to do. Conversely, if you had the kind of decisive battle which smashed and captured a large proportion of the enemy fleet, the kind of Nelsonian style battle, if you like, then things were slightly different, because usually you would have a lot more captured and or damaged ships to hand, but conversely there wouldn't be much of the enemy fleet left around, at which point, if you look, you can look at the aftermath of Trafalgar as an example. Basically anything that wasn't fit to be sailed, whether it was captured or just friendly but damaged, would be rigged up with a towing vessel, and those towing vessels would then make for whatever was the chosen best available harbour. In most cases, post-Trafalgar, that was Gibraltar. But other active warships, a few might hang around for escort, but others may well, still be sitting on station, just making sure that the last dregs of the enemy weren't around. But they could afford to be a little bit freer and a little bit more open and less formation-like, because, if you've had a decisive battle and you've got half the enemy fleet with you and the other half's been badly shot up, chances are there aren't going to be any major enemy ships around anymore. That was a little bit of a risk, because there could be the odd 4 or 5 ship squadron from somewhere else that shows up, but most of the time they accepted that risk and took it. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what ship named after a historical naval figure had a battle record that was most reminiscent of the character and accomplishments of its namesake? So, yeah, there's quite a few ships that have been named after historic figures, a fair number of which, definitely don't have battle records that kind of resemble their and historical precedents that were famous enough to get the ship named after them in the first place. With the best will in the world, none of the Lord Nelsons or Nelsons that the Royal Navy's ever produced have had quite the same battle record as the original. But if I was going to go for any particular one in the time that the Channel covers, I'd say Iron Duke probably has a decent shot at it. Iron Duke, obviously named after the Duke of Wellington, and you think about it, what did the Duke of Wellington do? He led his army to victory, and then lived an extraordinarily long life with slightly odd things happening to him towards the end of his life. And what does Iron Duke do? Well, she leads her fleet to victory at Jutland as the flagship, i.e. the general, and then goes on to lead for a battleship an extraordinarily long life and gets up to all sorts of weird shenanigans in the Second World War. So that's kind of a close parallel. I mean, there's not kind of a peninsular campaign style thing for HMS Iron Duke, but it's about the close enough, I would say. The Rogue Chief asks, if Hood was in such dire need of an overhaul in the late 1930s, and the Nelsons were newer and more heavily armed anyway, why not make Nelson or Rodney the new fleet flagship, thus freeing up Hood for the work she needed? Well, basically, although Hood was seen as kind of the national flagship, there were multiple fleets still in the Royal Navy, Mediterranean Fleet, Home Fleet, etc. And Rodney and Nelson pinged back and forth being flagship of one of the fleets, Hood the other, and Hood was kind of also the ambassador at large. But moreover, the larger issue was that because Rodney and Nelson tended to stay closer to the UK for the most part than Hood did, that's not to say Nelson and Rodney weren't deployed overseas. They were. There's quite a few photos of them in the Mediterranean Fleet, but, you know, they'd be in the Med, then back in the UK, in the Med, back in the UK, whereas Hood was a lot more of a globetrotter. And as a result, Nelson and Rodney would get a series of short upgrades, short refits. It wasn't anywhere near as comprehensive as the full modernizations, but they also didn't need them because by the time they hit the water, they were over a decade newer than most of the rest of the Royal Navy's battleships. And when it came to all the others, Hood, Renown, Repulse, the QEs and the Rs, what had happened is that in the early mid-1930s, the Royal Navy had drawn up a list of documents which basically went, this is the combat capability of all of our available capital ships. And they'd concluded at the time that the R-class were the least useful because they had they had the same armament as the QEs, but they were slower and they were smaller, so they were less capable of taking upgrades. So they decided, right, well, the R-class are going to go out of service when the King George V's come in. Basically, the KGVs would replace the Rs on a one-for-one basis. But they then appreciated that although the QEs were technically more capable than the Rs, the time it would take to build the KGVs and then build the Lions, which were the intended replacement for the QEs, would take the QEs as they existed in the early 1930s well beyond their useful combat effective lifespan. So it was imperative that the QEs get modernized. And Renown and Repulse also they're a little bit newer, but also been run quite hard. So Renown was selected for upgrade as well. So they were hoping to life extend those ships so that, you spent X million on the modernization and then you'd get maybe between 5 and 10 years worth of decent service out of them. At the time that those documents were written up, say early to mid-1930s, Hood was still in relatively good condition. Bear in mind, she was the third newest capital ship in the fleet. But then in the latter part of the 1930s, you had a couple of things. You had a number of significant advances in anti-aircraft fire control, obviously radar coming in and fire control tables and so on and so forth. Plus, you had people starting to build battleships again where you really didn't want them to. So there were the rumours of whatever Yamato was going to be. The Germans had started building the Bismarcks. The Italians had started building the second set of Littorios. And to be honest, the Italians had started actually practically building the first set of Littorios a little bit after the analysis of what should be modernised first had started, albeit they had keel laid before that analysis was complete. And all of a sudden, towards the very end of the 1930s, Hood started to rack up a bunch of issues from basically being run for one service lifetime without a full modernisation. As I've said before, kind of rule of thumb, unless you have major wartime use, a capital ship of the early 20th century can run for about 20 years before you start to see major issues with its machinery. And that's when you have to do some significant modernizations and upgrades. So it was this kind of confluence of events. The tactical picture in the late 30s had changed radically, but there was now a schedule, and they had draft documents considering what they could do to upgrade Hood, but it was always, well, we've got this, the QEs definitely need to be upgraded because, something like Barham or Malaya, as was kind of proven by the war, were, they definitely weren't up to the same capability as Warspite, Renown, QE, and Valiant. And bearing in mind that the Royal Navy was thinking that war would come in 42, 43, the kind of notional on paper plans and discussions they had in 39, which were talking about putting Hood in for modernisation, maybe 41, 42, and then coming out of that modernisation in 43, 44, that would put Hood into what they thought was going to be the war in a brand new condition, fully upgraded with the latest technology. And then, of course, war broke out a lot earlier than everybody thought it was going to, and it all came apart at the seams. I mean, so Repulse and Barham and Malaya also didn't get their modernizations. So I suppose that's a very long way of saying all of the issues that Hood would experience during wartime, which kind of pointed to the fact she desperately needed a full modernisation, really only began to stack up right before the war itself made that almost impossible. Wayne Borean asks, which were the biggest fleet design blunders in the 20th century? In other words, which countries so badly misunderstood their strategic and tactical situation and designed a fleet which was a bad fit for their specific needs? In every case, for the most part, there's usually a mitigating factor of some description. Sometimes that mitigating factor is more understandable, sometimes it's less understandable. So it's not like these people were complete and utter idiots, even if the decisions that were made may appear to be, and indeed in hindsight perhaps were, completely and utterly stupid. But in some ways, if you look at I would say the top 6 navies of the early part of the 20th century, so the US, the UK, Japan, Italy, Germany, and France, apart from maybe the Italians, you could kind of actually say that all of them made some pretty big fleet design blunders at some point in the early 20th century. The reason I exclude the Italians is because basically all the Italians were concerned about was dominating the Mediterranean, and realistically, in both World War I and World War II, they built a fleet that could do that against anything other than the biggest fleet on the planet. It's just unfortunate for them in World War II, they ended up fighting the biggest fleet on the planet. And then the other biggest fleet on the planet came to help the first biggest fleet on the planet. So you can't really blame the Italians for that one, at least not the Italian Navy. I mean, even Mussolini didn't plan on fighting the US and the UK combined, or the UK generally. Anyway, so moving on from Italy, the Japanese, their fleet built up for the Second World War could be seen as a fairly major design blunder. They built the best they could, and you can kind of see the logic of, if we're only allowed X number of ships, and for appearance's sake we have to pretend like we are keeping to both X number of ships and the restrictions on the size of X number of ships, you can see the logic in going, well, the only way for us to win is to have those ships be qualitatively superior to our opponents, so they can take on like 2-to-1 odds or 1.5-to-1 odds and win. If they're following the logic from the basis of we wish to defeat the Americans and, or the British, depending on whoever we're fighting in the Pacific, most likely the Americans, there's a certain sense to it. The fundamental problem with that logic was deciding that they could beat the Americans or the British in the Pacific in the first place. That was kind of where they went wrong. But, even then, if you're looking at it from a completely neutral perspective, it's difficult to see what else they could have done given the political pressures that they were under at the time, the fact that they weren't allowed to be allied with anyone anymore, and that they had they basically had this attitude of either we have to be able to dictate our own fate or others will dictate our fate for us, which, to be fair, given the look at world history, is not exactly it's not exactly a unique decision. Most nations at various points have taken that view, but going from we have a force capable of dictating our own fate and keeping ourselves safe in our little bubble, over to we need a force to defeat the fleet of a nation that has an economy that might as well be infinitely times larger than our own. That's kind of where the flaw came in the first place. The French, for the most part, you can basically write off almost anything pre-1920s, with the exception of some rather interesting experiments with aircraft carriers, as a design blunder, although that's kind of carrying through from the late 19th century. They are, to be fair, gradually recovering, back into the concept of actually producing homogeneous classes of ship. But a lot of their tactical thinking in terms of the range that battles are being fought at and whether or not you should invest in major infrastructure upgrades is still, a couple of steps behind everybody else. And then you kind of have this, as I've said before a few times, this kind of pause and reset in the 1920s. And then when they come back in a big way with the Dunkirks, Algerie, Richelieu, etc., the contre-torpilleers, all of a sudden they've at least got their design principles and idea of how they want to use their fleet back again, even if they're starting from a relatively small base to really. And it was that late 19th century stumble that really cost them, because France went from being sort of tussling for second in global naval power strength to a distant fourth, possibly fifth, depending on the year, thanks to those decisions. Germany, well, the High Seas Fleet pretty much was an epic design blunder, just the whole High Seas Fleet, because it shows the fundamental lack of understanding in the outlooks between powers that rely on the sea and powers that rely on land. The Germans were basically building the High Seas Fleet up as a deterrent and didn't realise that what for them was building something that should deter somebody from going after them while they went after someone else would actually be seen as a direct existential threat, a dagger pointed at the throat of the people that they wanted to just back off a bit. And in a lot of ways that poisoned Anglo-German relations. I mean, look at the beginning of the very beginning of the 20th century and the early 19th century, and Britain is still traditionally hostile to Russia and France and has relatively good relations with Germany. And obviously by World War I, Britain's in an alliance with Russia and France and diametrically opposed to Germany. And so by trying to avoid a war with the world's biggest navy at the time, they ended up creating a situation where you could almost guarantee they were going to be at war with the world's biggest navy at the time. The interwar Royal Navy, in some of its design decisions, could be seen as also sharing from this cup of woes, in that they, in some ways, over-specialised when they were designing some of their ships. Towards the end of the 1930s, they were getting the idea that actually there's a lot of different hostile powers out there. So when you see things like, mid-1930s, I guess, the Towns, the KGVs themselves, the Implacables, you're kind of seeing a more universal kind of design. But when you look back further to the Counties, the Leanders, the Arethuses, the Illustriouses, Ark Royal, etc., a lot of Royal Navy major warship design reflects a kind of almost monofocus on who they think the most likely opponent is at the time. So a lot of the stuff in the 20s and very early 30s focuses on a fleet designed to fight in the Pacific, which has some fairly significant weaknesses when it comes to fighting in close waters like the North Sea and the Mediterranean. And then everything almost flips on its head when they realise actually a European war is possibly more likely, and then you get a slew of ships that are much more designed for fighting in European waters, but with a number of design compromises that make them somewhat less than ideal for fighting in large open spaces like the Pacific. That, and the Treasury wouldn't give them the money to replace a bunch of very old ships they really could have gotten rid of and replaced with much better ones, like a lot of the earlier carriers. And with the US fleet, I think there's probably two things to pick them up on. One is that although it's understandable to agree why they did it, I think they held on to the standard class 21 knot top speed for a little bit too long, considering they're still designing for that in the early 1920s, when, the British have gone to, briefly to 24.5 knots, then down to 23 knots in 1913. The Japanese haven't produced a ship that's as slow as 21 knots for their battle fleet since the Kawachis, etc. So, that was, I think, a little bit of a misstep. You could, as I say, you can understand the doctrine of the standard battle line and to a certain extent why they're doing it and why they might hold on to it for a little bit, but by 1916, 1917, you really should think about maybe making your ships just a fraction faster, at the very least. The other thing would be not a specific fleet makeup, but in the 1930s, especially towards the late 1930s, there's a whole slew of new technology and weapons being introduced. And whilst the Mark 14 torpedo is kind of the classic example of it all, there's a bunch of others as well. And that isn't so much, it's not so much a fleet design issue as a fleet doctrine issue, in that they're coming up with, as I say, all this fancy new high-tech stuff, but not forgetting to test it. In a lot of cases, there's just being refused permission to test it, which results in the US Navy entering the World War II period, albeit not World War II itself, because that's a couple of years down the line, with a bunch of stuff which works on paper, but no one has ever actually proved works in practice. Now, some of those issues, they're lucky enough to get resolved in the period between September 1939 and December 1941, because people do finally start testing things and discovering actually this really doesn't work very well. We need to either fix it or replace it. But, as we've been seeing earlier this week, some weapons still don't get tested, and then they go to war and this sucks. Help. Fireteam Joker asks, while doing some research, I came across something called a German rescue buoy. I know they're technically not boats or ships, but I was hoping you'd tell us more about them. How common were they, and how extensively were they deployed? So the idea came about basically when Germany had occupied France and was fighting with the UK over the English Channel, or the planes were having to go over the English Channel to find the RAF. And this led to a somewhat embarrassing complication, well, actually for both sides, but mainly for the Germans because they were the ones mostly coming over the Channel, which was that if an aircraft was shot down over the Channel, or perhaps if it was badly damaged over the UK and was limping home and the engine gave out, or it was progressively becoming less and less flyable, but the pilot just didn't necessarily want to bail out over UK soil because then he'd definitely become a prisoner of war, you had planes going down in the Channel on a fairly regular basis, and, a pilot, even in an area of water notionally relatively small like the Channel, is going to be very difficult to find, especially given that, if you have a seaplane, wandering around, or multiple seaplanes wandering around looking for them, even if they see them, the RAF has no real way of telling, is this seaplane on a mission of mercy, or is this seaplane on some form of strike or reconnaissance role, so they get shot down a fair bit as well, which adds to the number of pilots in the water, which doesn't really help. So they, after a little bit of design work, ended up designing what you can see on screen, this kind of little rescue buoy, which is basically a floating accommodation hut. It can take, I think they've got 4, depending on the layout, 4 to 6 bunks. So basically they can accommodate the crew of a bomber relatively comfortably. Or obviously multiple fighters. And it has supplies, food, ability to signal, etc., etc. And the idea was, if you paint these brightly, put some red crosses on them as well so everyone knows that these are not warlike things, so please don't sink them. You can string them out along the Channel, tell the pilots they exist, so then if the pilot is going to go down in the Channel, if it's a crash landing, like I said, maybe a bomber's had its engine shot up and they're failing as they come home, they can look out for one and crash land near it and go aboard it. And even if a pilot's been shot down in a somewhat more violent, immediate situation, like a fighter dogfight or something, then hopefully they can take a couple of seconds to look around and see maybe where one might be, and head for that. And so the idea basically then was that the pilot could get to the buoy, they would be there and home and dry, relatively home and dry, much quicker and much more safely than if they were just lying around in the water waiting for a seaplane to show up. And then you could have just a couple of dedicated patrols instead of loads of them patrolling all over the channel, and every so often, maybe depending on if you got signal from the buoy or not, but at least once a day, you could just have a patrol fly down the channel, someone keeping an eye on all the buoys. Does that buoy have its flag up? No. Next one? No. Next one? Ah, that one does. Right, we'll go over and land there and pick everybody up. And that way you save pilots' lives. So that was the idea. They worked relatively well to a certain extent. There were about 50 of them deployed through the channel, although there were never 50 at any one time, because occasionally one would get swamped or it would break loose its moorings and go wandering around. That's one of the ways the British found out about them, when one of them washed ashore. And they actually ended up being used by both sides, because, well, if you're a pilot going down in the channel and you see this big floating yellow thing with red cross markings on it, you're going to head for it, regardless, which did lead to some interesting conversations, because the RAF also eventually would deploy their own versions, although much smaller numbers. And as I say, you would occasionally get these interesting conversations where pilots from one side would rock up to a buoy and discover that there was already occupied by pilots from the other side. And then it was a question of who's going to come and collect us first, and therefore who's going to be the prisoners and who's going to get to fight another day. There is a much more extensive video on both the German buoys primarily, but also on the British equivalents, by the channel Callum, and that's linked in the video description at the timestamp for this question. So go and have a look at that for more detailed information. Sapper Ninja asks, I recently watched the documentary series Warship Life at Sea and was pretty surprised to watch HMS Northumberland playing cat and mouse with a Eudoly only 20 miles off the coast of Faslane. My question is, how normal was sabre rattling / posturing like this in history? Would it be normal if, in say 1938, for a random Deutschland to be hanging around Scapa Flow? And what about other periods in history? Have a random picture of USS Tennessee just because I really like the picture. Anyway, it really wasn't that common, actually, in part because the Cold War is relatively unique in that you've got two major powers at a very extensive multi-decade standoff where both fundamentally understand that the other is the enemy. And, it's kind of like a standoff in the old westerns where both sides are gradually reaching for their holsters, but neither side wants to be the one that, really goes for the pistol first. Or the revolver, I guess, in the West. But anyway, you get the general point. Before the Cold War, generally speaking, everyone either pretended or genuinely wanted to avoid war almost up until the day that it was declared. And a lot of times, people, weirdly enough, when you look back at it through history, were apoplectically angry on one side or the other that the other lot had declared war on them. Human behaviour, I guess. But as a result, the kind of prolonged spying off of enemy military installations that characterised the Cold War, it didn't really tend to happen that much, and that's on largely two bases. One is that, believe it or not, prior to roughly the start of the 20th century, operational security wasn't really a thing. You couldn't just wander onto a naval base. There would be sentries who would challenge you, and there was a fear of enemy agents who might sabotage things, but the kind of extremely closed off, restricted nature of naval bases, in this case, that you get these days. Back in the day, if an ambassador showed up, or a contingent of ships, or a ship from a foreign nation, and they made the appropriate flags and signal salutes and everything, or there was some other kind of visiting dignitary, then it was just considered polite manners to show them round your shipyard if they asked to see it. And you could sail up to the shipyard or past it in a boat if you wanted to, quite easily. So you didn't need this kind of aggressive patrolling by an active warship off the coast. You could just send someone to have a much closer look and see what was going on, and no one would really bat an eye. Now, we're not saying that it would be kind of, oh yes, French ambassador circa 1780, please come and inspect Portsmouth Royal Dockyard or Chatham or wherever. They weren't that stupid. There were understandings that, okay, maybe we're not so friendly with this lot, but maybe we're more friendly with that lot. And so, you might be shown a selected and carefully curated part of the yard, but that would still be a lot more than you could ever observe from the heaving deck of a warship, 15, 20 miles out. So it still had some benefit. Plus, of course, as Yes Minister, or Yes Prime Minister rather charitably points out, at least especially in Britain's case, over the course of the 16th to 19th century, Britain has basically fought everybody in alliance with everybody else. So at some point, knowledge of various yards that Britain had either visited as friends and were now fighting them as enemies, or people who had visited British shipyards as friends and were now fighting Britain as enemies, would end up in various people's hands. And then you've got this kind of 50-year window between the Cold War, between the kind of the rough end of that kind of policy and the Cold War. And even then you still had, visits by ships and officers, literally right up to a couple of months before World War One. In fact, a couple of weeks before World War One, in one or two cases, there were British warships in Kiel, with people being merrily toured around and getting a very close-up and personal look at the heart of the Kaiserliche Marine, which basically just leaves you with the interwar period. And in the interwar period, again, if you really wanted to spy on somebody's shipyards, just hire a private plane. Controlled airspace the way it is now didn't really exist all that much, so yeah, you could just hire a plane and fly over or around the shipyard and take whatever photos and observations you wanted, which again is far superior to sitting offshore in a warship. David Stange Jr. asks, what are the origins and earliest use of the convoy system, and how effective was it in protecting merchant ships from enemy predation? So convoys have come and gone as a popular way of keeping things safe over time. They're actually very, very old. So convoys basically have existed for almost as long as there's been a clear division between warships and merchant ships, which means that the very, very earliest convoys go back to Greco-Roman / late Phoenician times. And then if you define a convoy as a group of merchant vessels escorted by warships, then convoys start to kind of disappear in maybe the 3rd or 4th century-ish in most places, largely because warship and merchant ship kind of merge back together on most of the seas by geographical area. Obviously in places like in the Byzantine area of control, they still have dedicated warships. But across the good chunk of the Mediterranean and then out into the Atlantic and so forth, and across most of the planet, what was a warship and what was a merchant ship was largely a matter of what was aboard it, not what the ship design itself was. And then as you start to see the emergence of somewhat dedicated warships again in after 1100-ish, the convoy system comes back again. So yeah, the origins and earliest use of convoys are ancient times, In terms of effectiveness, the effectiveness of convoys works on two major principles. The first of which is that by concentrating the merchant ships in one particular spot, you're actually making it a lot more difficult for enemy ships to find your merchant ships. Because if you have, especially you're talking about the older convoys, 100 plus merchants all in one group, well, those 100 plus merchants would otherwise have been scattered out across the ocean, which, is 100 opportunities for a raider to fall in with one of them. Whereas if they're all in one spot with not a tremendously larger overall kind of visual range for finding them, then you've only got one chance to find the convoy, or maybe 1.5 chances compared to finding a single merchant ship. So the odds of a merchant raider even coming across them in the first place are quite low. Of course, if they do find them, that's why you have to have the escort. So the other half of the convoy idea is that you then escort them with enough force that any potential enemy raider is not capable of attacking those ships. And because you have significantly fewer warships than there are merchant ships, that's why you need to concentrate the merchant ships. It also allows you to concentrate your warship escorts to a certain degree as well. And that element, up until at least the arrival of U-boats, which brings up the whole thing of whether or not you can even see the person attacking you, but prior to that, whether or not your escort is strong enough is usually where convoy systems rise or fall, because obviously if the convoy is larger, it's therefore more valuable. Therefore, if your enemy is powerful, they're more likely to dedicate significantly greater resources to going after a convoy than they are going after single ships. And a single convoy can then also represent a significant strategic asset for your nation if it's got enough vital supplies aboard it. And so, whilst a small convoy with a frigate or two in escort might be easily enough to protect those ships from attacks by pirates and most privateers, if you've got a convoy of 100, 200 ships and they're carrying, say, enough grain to feed your population for several months, which was definitely a thing during the 18th century, well, the enemy might very well send an entire fleet of ships of the line to stop that convoy. So you have to dedicate an entire fleet of ships of the line to protect it. And that's why at least one battle of the 18th century is seen as a tactical British victory, but a strategic defeat, because the British managed to take on and destroy or capture a significant-sized French fleet. So, tactically, great warship-on-warship confrontation, except that in sacrificing themselves, the massive convoy that French fleet was protecting, by and large, got away. And the strategic implications of that were far, 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 far greater than the loss of half a dozen to a dozen warships. Brian Stevens asks, in Culture and Carnage by Victor Davis Hanson, he recounts the horrors of death at sea, especially with sailors drowning. I understand enslaved troops were forced onto boats by the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. However, it seems bizarre to me that people would join a navy voluntarily and not learn to swim. Today we have life jackets, but back then how common was it for sailors not being able to swim? In terms of significant unaided continuous swimming, it wasn't very common at all. But there is a graduation of things. For one thing, if you ended up in the water, chances were there's probably going to be a bunch of wreckage, wooden material for the most part, floating around that you can grab onto, which will help. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that a large number of sailors, a majority of sailors, didn't know how to swim, period. That would be somewhat dumb, because there's two sides to it. On the one hand, there's not much motivation for sailors back then to learn how to swim incredibly long distances, because if your ship goes down in the middle of the Atlantic or the middle of the Mediterranean or whatever, it doesn't matter if you can swim 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters or 3,000 meters. You're just going to die tired. And you don't need to know how to swim long distances to just hold on to a lump of wood and kick your way gradually to wherever it is you want to go, or where you think you might want to go. But on the other hand, not being able to swim at all, i.e. someone chucks you over the side and you just immediately start drowning, that is, at least from what I've studied, far, far less common. Absolute lack of swimming capability. Most sailors, and when I say most, I mean over 50%, seem to have had some capability to swim, even if it was only for short distances. And you can understand why. I mean, if you're a man overboard and your ship's going to drop a boat to come and get you, you want to be able to tread water for 10-15 minutes till they can haul you back aboard. If it's incredibly hot and people decide they're going to go fishing or swimming in a bay, or you just need to swim 100 yards to shore, you want to be able to do that. I mean, heck, even if you're going from your ship anchored in harbour to the shore in a boat, and the boat overturns for whatever reason, the ability to swim a couple of 100 yards to the shoreline is pretty darn useful, and so on and so forth. So rudimentary swimming capability would have been, relatively common, but you have to factor in a couple of things. One is that, if you're prepared for a swim, as the term suggests, prepare yourself. You might take your shirt off or whatever. Whereas if you're in an unprepared position, you end up in the water with all of your clothes. That can be quite a drag on you quite quickly. And the other thing to take into account is shock value of being suddenly dumped in the water, because even if you're an Olympic grade swimmer, if you are on a lovely hot day, in battle on a ship of the line, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, big pitch of the waves, cannonball explodes. Well, cannonball doesn't explode nearby, but cannonball hits nearby and a big splinter just knocks you over the side or whatever. You got the wind knocked out of you. You end up in the freezing cold North Atlantic. Instinctively you gasp in, and then now your lungs are full of North Atlantic seawater and you're dead within 30 seconds, if you're lucky. That kind of thing can also give rise to the idea that sailors don't know how to swim, because if you get unexpectedly dumped in the ocean, chances are you're probably, you're either going to be dead within 10-15 seconds from immediate drowning, or you're going to last however long it takes for hypothermia to set in. That tends to be what happens when people are unexpectedly introduced to the sea. It's kind of like, medieval mortality rates, where, loads and loads of people die in childhood, and then if you somehow manage to get past your 18th birthday, you probably have a significantly longer life ahead of you. Matt Osborne asks, I recently learned about tasters on Viking ships. How have humans used sounding leads to navigate the North Sea and other waters? So in the deep ocean, this method isn't really practicable, because one, you don't tend to have 5 miles of rope aboard, and even if you did, you'd never be able to haul it all back up again. But if you are doing an oceanic voyage, you can at least use this method in the coastal areas when you detect that you are near land, and you can use it in the relatively shallow seas, Mediterranean, Baltic, North Sea, etc., and across the world. Now, the way that you do this once it's fully developed, which, even by the Viking era, the migration era, they've kind of already got this down fairly pat, is that you have a lead weight, which you then have attached to a rope, and the idea is you chuck that over the side of the ship, it sinks, and then when it hits the bottom, you can go, right, okay, so much rope has gone through, we haul it back up, so therefore the water is this deep, roughly speaking. And again, by this point, they've also managed to work out how to put a concave shape in the base of the weight, and then they put something sticky, usually tallow fat or something, because that would also then, obviously, bits of the seabed would stick to it. So whether that be sand, silt, rocks of varying sizes, etc. and would come up with the line. So this would also tell you what the nature of the seabed was, and occasionally you might get a fish, which would be a bit irritating because that's not what necessarily you wanted at the time. So how does that information help you? Well, you will have seen, probably looking around, the various forms of interesting navigational aids that people came up with in the absence of maps and the ability to work out longitude. So you've seen things like the Polynesian sailors in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans with sort of grids and so forth that told them by currents and so forth where islands were and how to get there. And with the North Sea and other navigational areas, finding latitude, again, by the 8th, 9th, 10th century was not tremendously difficult. But it was the finding the longitude that was always the problem. So what you could do then, combining a knowledge of latitude with your lead sounding weights, was compile, either by verbal law or by written accounts or however you wanted to do it, a knowledge of how to get from point A to point B by using these things to indicate roughly how far along you were. So, let's say you are going on a raid and you're going from Norway, so this is going to be a Viking raid, and you want to end up somewhere off of the Northumbrian coast because that you've heard that's a good raiding area. So you might either know this already, or you could consult with someone who does know this, and you would not, then once you set out, okay, so when I set out from where I am, the water is, I'm going to use an arbitrary measure, 4 fathoms deep for a day's sailing heading west at my latitude. But Northumbria, if I want to get to this bit of the Northumbrian coast, I need to drop down a bit. I need to drop down a couple of latitude measures. So what we're going to do is we're going to sail west until the water starts to deepen out beyond 4 fathoms, and the seabed goes from sand to rocky. And when we hit that point, then we know roughly where we are. So now we can sail south. We then go to the new latitude. Then we check the soundings again. And in this area, the water should be 8 fathoms deep and sandy. Okay, so then we know we're in the right area, right? So then we head west. And now as we're going along, if we think we're near the Northumbrian coast, well, the Northumbrian coast is, I don't know what the Northumbrian coast seabed is like, but let's say it's silty, for example, whereas before, when we've picked up some sand. So we keep testing the line, and then when it starts to show sand, we know that we're near the coast, and keep on our latitude. And then eventually the water will start to get shallower and shallower, and then we know we're really near the coast, even if the weather is bad and there's fog or it's dark or whatever. And so we're prepared to land in roughly the area we actually hoped to land, and then reverse that for getting home, and so on and so forth. And that would be a sort of a broad outline of how you can navigate using a sounding lead and a basic knowledge of latitude to go around basically any seas or waters where the water is shallow enough that your sounding lead can actually reach the bottom. Grumman Cat asks, can you describe holy stoning? How often was it needed? How much of the crew was required to carry it out? And how long did it take for a capital ship? Also, how hard did you have to scrub? And how many times could it be done before the decking had to be replaced? Grumman Cat asks, can you describe holy stoning? How often was it needed? How much of the crew was required to carry it out? And how long did it take for a capital ship? And how hard did you have to scrub? How many times could it be done before the decking had to be replaced? We'll take a look at this photo. Notice how most of the people actually doing the holy stoning are not so enthusiastic as the ones who are watching them do it. Now, the purpose of holy stoning was twofold. It was using a kind of a friable sandstone block, which is basically an abrasive. Part of the idea was originally to keep the decks safe, because as decks wore, you might have things embedded in them, you might have splinters come up, etc. And considering that back in the day a lot of sailors went around with bare feet, this could be long-term negative. So holy stoning, scrubbing everything down to a nice smooth surface, was a way of keeping the ship in maintenance and good order, but also, obviously, dirt and so forth would build up on the decks. So by holystoning, you also made them clean again. So holystoning was very often done during the approach of a ship heading into port, but depending on exactly how enthusiastic the captain was about keeping the ship all nice and shiny, it could end up being done even as much as, twice a day. On a capital ship, I mean, it depends on the size of the capital ship. Ships of the line, it was said, you could have a good chunk of the crew working on it for 3 to 4 hours to get everything nice and shiny. I dread to think how long it would take to do the full deck of an Iowa class battleship, which did have its decks holystoned at points even well into the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century, that is. How you do it? Well, you could do it on your hands and knees, as you can see here. More often, there was a kind of a broom handle type arrangement, which you could attach the stone to instead. So that was a little bit better. And in terms of how many times you did it before the deck needed replacing, depends on how thick the deck was and how enthusiastically everyone was scrubbing and how often. So that's kind of a bit of an open-ended question. Although, while I was looking up information for this, mostly trying to find out exactly what the holy stones were made out of, I did come across this rather amusing account. This is from a clipper in the 19th century. Well, you can imagine how much effort had to go into holystoning this particular ship. So the account goes, "We just finished holystoning the decks and the paint on the bulwarks was hardly dry. The second mate had a 50-pound keg of black paint in the paint locker on one side of the bowsprit under the topgallant forecastle. Unfortunately, the sailors owned a large Borneo monkey or baboon, and he had been made fast on the bowsprit within reach of the paint. He upset the bucket of paint, which ran down the scuppers as far as the mainmast, over the clean white deck. The second mate, as soon as it was found out, caught the monkey and swabbed the paint up with him till he would hold no more, and then threw him overboard. But this made bad worse, for the monkey caught the side ladder hanging over the main rigging, and came up, and before anyone could stop him, he ran the whole length of the bulwarks, leaving black paint all over the fresh straw-coloured paint, and making an awful mess. The man who owned him caught him, and hurried him into the forecastle, but it was all hands to clean ship, for the decks had to be scraped and wiped off, and then painted again, for Sunday must find the ship in perfect order. And the second mate was as mad as a man could be for a time, but he soon got over it after the ship was to rights again, and he never went after the monkey afterwards, who was a great pet." So yeah, pro tip, if you're going to be stuck holystoning decks, don't let monkeys near large barrels of paint. Drew Mikola asks, "In the Battle of Samar, the US destroyers and destroyer escorts were lucky the Japanese were using armour-piercing shells, merely punching holes clean through their ships, at least until the Japanese wised up and started using HE. Are there any other notable examples of this in history?" Quite a lot, actually. Most of the Age of Sail, bizarrely enough, could be considered this, because it turns out that when you're talking about properly heavyweight cannon, so 24, 32, 42 pounders, and local equivalents in other weight values, you can't really make a ship, at least at close range, proof against those shots. The shot's just going to go through. And yeah, it'll cause damage by splinters to people nearby, and if it hits something major like a structural beam, the splinters will be worse. If it hits you directly, that's going to be a very bad day. But you can quite often have a cannonball blast straight into a ship and straight out the other side, and everyone's kind of like, I guess that happened. Never mind, carry on. Which is one of the reasons why Age of Sail ships needed so many cannon to put down their opponents. And even then, sinking an Age of Sail ship of the line was actually a very rare event unless something caught fire. This is one of the reasons why shells were invented and put into action aboard ships. So kind of that's, you could almost say a good chunk of the Age of Sail was ships firing AP rounds at each other when they could have had a lot more luck firing HE if someone had invented HE, i.e. the explosive shell, in a ship portable format much sooner. Then when you get into well, the Ironclad age, there's a limited number of engagements to draw from. But even then, guns had a variety of rounds because you had explosive shells, which were still held to be good at taking apart wooden warships, but their contact detonation kind of features were not so good, obviously, at taking apart ironclads. So then you have, the Austro-Hungarian wooden ship of the line at the Battle of Lissa, which everyone's quite surprised it survives. And yes, it's got hit by a bunch of shells, which people are surprised didn't sink it. But also, when you look at what little evidence there is left over from the ship's battle damage records and photos, there's also a lot of individual holes because guns had been ramping up in power with solid shot to punch through ironclad's armour, and it turns out if you have this, what's effectively in Age of Sail terms a rail gun, and you fire at a ship of the line, it's like, yep, that's a hole, all right. Cool, what else do you want to do today? And then when you get to World War I and World War II, there are some instances of ships being attacked by armour-piercing shells that just go straight through them and out the other side, but there's also quite a lot of instances of, along the same principle, of ships being hit by armour-piercing bombs, either small ships being hit by quite large armour-piercing bombs that go straight through the ship, or even larger ships that are hit by armour-piercing bombs in areas where an HE bomb probably would have done a lot more damage. We've got semi-armour piercing bombs in there as well. So there's quite a few accounts, especially for aircraft carriers and some other large ships, of being hit in unprotected areas where an AP or semi-armour piercing bomb has hit the ship and then gone out through the ship. And they've again, kind of, yeah, cool story, bro. There's a hole in the ship. Oh no, whatever shall we do? Lucky it wasn't a general purpose bomb. That really could have messed us up in this area. Which is, kind of it's the balance of probabilities that bombers have to take of are we going to hit the armoured area where the general purpose bomb will be useless, or are you going to hit the unarmoured area where the AP bomb might be useless? And in some ways you could even argue that HMS Warspite survives the Italian campaign in part because of this, because obviously it gets hit by a Fritz X, which goes straight through and out the bottom and into the water before exploding. Now, if that Fritz X hadn't been more of a gigantic flying AP round, then given the amount of explosive it had on board, it could have done some pretty serious damage, possibly even sunk Warspite, as it did a number of other ships. But in the event, it was actually too much AP because, as big as it was, Warspite was able to go, a hole. Okay, I guess we will patch that. Now, granted, it did take a fair bit of repairs to get Warspite mostly operational thereafter, but it could have been a lot worse. Which kind of then, winds forward to the sinking of Roma, and Roma, of course, being a larger ship with a much more, in theory, comprehensive armour scheme, at least against incoming bombs, and it gets blown up and sunk by Fritz X hits, potentially because its armour actually initiated the fuse but slowed the bomb down enough that the bomb was still inside the ship when it exploded, rather than just going straight through, which paradoxically means some of the early heavy anti-shipping weapons like Fritz X and tall boys for that matter were probably actually more effective against more modern ships than they were against older ships. Alternate historian Turtle Duck asks, how were the tonnage limits for the Washington Naval Treaty decided on? For most ships, it's actually a surprisingly simple process. They sat down and they looked at what they were building at the moment, and they went, okay, what is everybody building in relatively significant numbers that they really, 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 really don't want to have to scrap? So for the Japanese, the Nagatos, and most of the Colorados for the Americans, and then when you go down to cruisers, things like the Hawkins class for the British, and everyone kind of looked at it and went, okay, so 16-inch guns on the battleships? Yeah, we don't want to outlaw those because you're going to have to scrap a bunch of new stuff. So we're just going to limit it at 16 inches. All right, cool. Yep, cool. And then down to the cruisers. Okay, the Hawkins has the 7.5-inch gun. That's a uniquely British armament. Everyone else's approximate equivalent is the 8-inch. So are we happy banning everything above 8-inch? Because that lets the British keep the Hawkins, which they're quite keen on keeping. Okay, going once, going twice. Sold. Right, everyone, we're banning guns above 8-inch for cruisers. And it's kind of similar with displacement. It was, what's the displacement of the Nagatos, the Queen Elizabeths, the Colorados? What's the displacement of the Hawkins? What's the displacement of some of the other cruisers people are planning? And you said, okay, broadly between 30 and 35,000 tons. Allow a little bit of modification for new technology, anti-aircraft armament, and so forth. So yeah, nice round figure, 35,000 tons, cool, and that's nicely divisible by whole numbers. So we can set upper limits of battleship displacements. Excellent, right? Sold on 35,000 tons. Cruisers, a little bit more growth room for them because everyone's still a little bit unsure what the new cruiser design should look like, because we know the older cruiser designs are probably on their way out. So, rounding up a bit again, mostly off the Hawkins class. Bit heavier than the Hawkins, 10,000 tons. Again, nice round number. Cool, right, excellent. 10,000 tons and 8 inches it is. I mean, I'm going through the speed run version, but that was basically a lot of it was kind of very much what's a nice round figure slightly above that which everybody is currently using anyway. And that was kind of the rule of thumb for most things. The only exception to that being aircraft carriers, because, of course, at that point, nobody had any aircraft carriers that were anywhere close to the displacement figures that were actually finally decided upon. But those were decided upon mostly by various naval designers, particularly the US in that case, looking at going, well, this would probably be the ideal weight for an aircraft carrier, and then it was negotiated up and down a bit depending on various nations' preferences. And that's basically how you get the tonnage limits at the Washington Treaty. Jim Smitty asks, what is the worst possible weather that a navy in the age of steam and steel tried to fight it out? I.e., if the ships were taking green water over the bow, would it still be possible to even bring the guns into action? Or would most commanders go, nope, this is not weather we're fighting in? And where would such a line be? I don't think there is a particular line. The line is defined by exactly how crazy and aggressive the captain or admiral in question actually is. Because, well, probably the single worst weather is an action I keep coming back to quite a bit, mostly because of the bad weather, which is the action off of Lofoten between Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Renown. That's properly bad weather. They're all, battle cruisers, battleships. They're all above 30,000 tons, powering through the water. Renown's had to leave her destroyer escort behind because they just flat out can't keep up in the weather. And as the battle goes on, the weather's so bad that everyone's taking water over their bows. The German ships are having the brass cartridge cases that make up the aft portion of their charges chucked back into the turrets by the force of the water. So that tells you how both the water is green over the bows all the way to the forward turrets and how violent it is at that point. And Renown has a chunk of her torpedo blisters ripped off by the water. So, you're talking about storms violent enough to do serious structural damage to, 30-plus thousand ton capital ships. And they're still fighting in that, albeit not for a tremendous amount of time before the Germans decide this is a dumb idea and leave. But yeah, it is possible. I don't think many commanders would have fought that action, but some will. John McCarthy asks, when war games were used by navies to test tactics and prepare for battles, how would you summarise the rules? How did they compare to reality? And if they compared well, how good were they at predicting real-world outcomes? Unfortunately, with a subject as broad as naval war games, it's impossible to summarise the rules as a whole, because almost everybody had their own idea of what naval war games should be, and even within a given nation or a given fleet, there were different levels of war games. So the US fleet problems, for example, were war games, and that involved actually physically taking an entire fleet and aircraft, manoeuvring them, sailing them, and in some cases even firing offset guns although that was a bit of a later procedure adopted off the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy didn't have as frequent large-scale fleet exercises as the American fleet problems, but they also did that, and they're the ones who originated the idea of sighting in on your opponent, then firing a known offset and measuring the fall of shell of the actual fall of shell compared to the known offset, and then working out if you would have hit or not. Yes, that is relatively dangerous, but then it gets. There could be live exercises that don't involve quite the same scale. You have stand-in ships, you have live exercises that require slightly less aggressive forms of shooting at each other, a bit more calculated. And then as things move ashore, you can have war games that are conducted entirely on paper, war games that are conducted partly on paper and partly with small models. You can have war games that are conducted in what you might term semi-simulated environments, like the ones that WATU did at Western Approaches Commands. And obviously every single one of those is going to have different rules aiming to generate different levels of reality. And then you factor in the different nationalities, and as I said, it's basically impossible to summarize the rules of naval war games. As for how they compare to reality, for the most part, the bigger ones were actually relatively good, believe it or not, at least for the time. Where most of the outcomes of war games differed from real life was when the war games had been run without certain technologies in play. So the Japanese had war games about how to fight the Americans had war games about how to fight the Japanese, the British had war games about how to fight almost anybody. But for all the war games they'd run in the 1930s, the reality of what fast monoplane aircraft were capable of wasn't a thing through most of the 1930s, so they physically couldn't wargame for that. The reality of what radar could do, again, not really a thing in the 1930s, so you can't wargame it without arbitrarily inventing rules and so forth. So a lot of the stuff that people say, oh yes, well, these navies were stupid because they didn't see this coming. Well, no, they didn't see that coming, because if somebody had turned around and said in the mid 1930s, well, you're going to have aircraft capable of 300 miles an hour carrying 1,000-pound bombs, and people are going to be able to see through the darkness like it wasn't even there, as long as you're not too close to the coastline, they would have looked at you and gone, you what, mate? That's not a thing. And at the time it wasn't. Maybe a few far-looking visionaries might think that such things are possible in the future, but bearing in mind that the development of radar came partly due to the development of, the attempted development of a death ray. So in the early 1930s, you might equally plausibly have said everybody in the 1940s will be armed with death rays, and then everyone will die immediately and horribly. So, yeah, it's kind of a hit and miss. Some of the broader tactical implications of war games definitely did play out. Initially, the US doctrine of keeping all their carriers separate, because if one got found, it died. Okay, Coral Sea and Midway tended to bear that out, but as you got in through to Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons, it was becoming less and less the case as things were developing, especially with anti-aircraft firepower, and so tactics had to change from what pre-war doctrine influenced through war games had suggested it would be. And to be fair to them, opening engagements of Guadalcanal, Japanese night fighting doctrine, where they planned to fight huge enemy fleets, when applied on a smaller scale for cruiser actions, they broadly had the better of it, and their tactics were fairly sound, at least until, radar and so forth started messing with them. Duke Master asks, Derflinger took quite the pounding at Jutland and survived it all, earning the respect of the Royal Navy with the nickname Iron Dog. Having recently watched your Sadelitz video, there looks to be a competitor for such an honour. Which one do you think perhaps deserves the nickname more, or is there room for both? Now, much as Sadelitz has a well-deserved reputation for toughness, I think of the two, Derflinger probably deserves the title slightly more. largely on the grounds that Der Flinger, made it away relatively intact and was seen to, take a bunch of punishment and sail off mostly on an even keel. Seydlitz took a lot of punishment, but very definitely did not make it away mostly intact. She was, at the last point the British saw her visibly down by the bows, and they were relatively convinced for a fair time after the battle that they had actually sunk her. And to be fair, by certain definitions, they did. If you classify sinking as, taking on enough water that you hit the bottom of the sea, like look at, for example, in Pearl Harbor, West Virginia is classified as sunk, even though a good chunk of her was still above the water because she'd hit the seabed, she'd lost buoyancy. Seydlitz did do that. It just happened that they were able to almost immediately salvage her and haul her in a bit further and a bit further until they could get her into dock. So, Seydlitz is right on the borderline of, did we technically classify her as sunk and then quickly salvaged, or survived? Make your own judgment in those cases. But with that said, I think as a result, Der Flinger probably deserves the title just a little bit more. Seydlitz probably deserves a nickname, but it'd be something else, because basically, Der Flinger almost kind of walked it off. Seydlitz didn't. And therefore, while her survival is remarkable, her durability was very, very nearly overwhelmed. VideoDude26 asks, US standard type battleships, geared or direct drive turbines? I've encountered an irritating issue with some sources claiming that standard battleships, the ones with steam turbines, not the turboelectric ones, have direct drive turbines, while other sources claim they were geared turbines. Sometimes they change from direct to geared from one paragraph to the next in the same source. What's the actual story? Did the standards from USS Nevada onwards have direct drive turbines, geared turbines, or did they start out with direct drive and picked up geared sets later on? And how hard would it be to refit direct drive to geared? Refitting from direct drive to geared, it's going to be a monstrous job, because you have to get right down deep into the bowels of the ship and rip out the old system and put in the new system. But how difficult it's going to be in the context of a full engine replacement is largely going to be down to how big the machinery spaces are relative to the existing machinery sets. So if they've allowed themselves a little bit of space, then relatively speaking, upgrading to geared turbines shouldn't be too much of a problem, because the actual gear set itself is, in terms of the overall machinery, a relatively small portion. Whereas if it's everything sort of built to really, really tight tolerances, then you're going to have problems, because you may not be able to physically fit a gear set in there as well, albeit that by the time you're refitting from direct drive to geared, the turbine and other machinery assemblies themselves might be somewhat smaller, so they might create the space to fit the geared turbines in any case. Now, as for the overall question, the best sources, the ones I trust the most, which basically consist of the most reputable authors on US battleships and period documents from the US Navy, seem to indicate that everything prior to the turboelectric phase of the US standards was built with direct drive turbines. There is some mention in those sources, although not across all of them, that perhaps the cruising turbines, because they tended to have a pair of cruising turbines and a pair of high-speed turbines, that the cruising turbines perhaps on something like Nevada might have been geared. I say might because that's not universally agreed upon. Some of the period sources and some of the reputable authors say no, Nevada was just a pure direct drive turbine ship, but some others say it had the cruising, they actually specify that the cruising turbines were geared, but don't say that the main drive turbines were. And those same period documents refer to, for example, in the 1930s, the rebuilding of the New Mexicos, or the turbines in some of them are being replaced by direct their direct drive turbines are being replaced by new geared turbines. And the documentation surrounding the choice of selection for turboelectric drive seems to basically be talking about, well, we have direct drive turbines in service at the moment, and they're not particularly fuel efficient, and our choices are either geared turbines or turboelectric drive, and we're going with turboelectric drive, which would seem to indicate further evidence that the main drive systems of the pre-New Mexico, pre-Tennessee standards, where they're driven by turbines at all, looking at you, Oklahoma, are in fact, direct drive turbines. So I think that's the case. Switch 374 asks, USS Roanoke sank on launch, was refloated and then served. Why did she sink, and can you tell us more about the incident? Unfortunately, beyond numerous sources reporting that she did indeed sink on launch and had to be refloated, there's not a tremendous amount of detail on the hows or the whys of it available in at least all the books that I've got. There are one or two references to primary source documents, but those documents are in the US National Archives, and they have yet to be digitized. So unless I can get over there, which hopefully maybe later this year, maybe next, probably more like next at this point, I can't provide any further detail, but I will add it to my list of priority documents to look up and then bring more details to you. Paul from Chicago asks, in the early 20th century Royal Navy, how were pensions for sailors determined? How did good conduct medals enter into this? How easy was it for an awkward officer to pull a man's pension? So the good news is it was basically impossible by the early 20th century for a Royal Navy sailor to not get a pension, assuming he'd done what he needed to do to be entitled to it, which was to serve for 20 years. Once you'd served 20 years in the Navy, you could retire on a Navy pension, and the only thing at that point that disqualified you from getting a pension, if you'd done your 20 years, was if you'd gone overseas and fought under a foreign flag. That was literally it. You could be the single worst sailor in the Navy and you'd still get a pension as long as they hadn't kicked you out by 20 years. In fact, there was a bit of a furor in Parliament during the First World War, which concerned the fact that there were quite a few men who'd reached pension age in the latter part of 1914 and obviously therefore were due to retire, but because of the war, they were being retained. They weren't being allowed to be discharged, and the Royal Navy was not paying them standard pay because they weren't assigned to ships. They hadn't signed up for a new 5-year contract. They also weren't paying them their pension because the position of some of the bureaucrats was, well, you only get your pension once you've been discharged after 20 years, and these men haven't been discharged. We're, keeping them almost by force in the area. And so they were being paid what was called detention pay, which was 2p a day, which was very little and was causing quite a bit of uproar in Parliament from people who rightly felt that, either give these men their pension or give them some decent pay. This kind of just little per diem tide over stuff is ridiculous because even in 1914, 2p a day wasn't very much. But in terms of what your pension could be, so the basic pension in the early 20th century, using 1914 as an example, because this is where a lot of the documentation comes from because of this big furor, your basic pension, if you did 20 years service and that's all you had, was 10p a day. If during your career you'd managed to get 3 good conduct badges, you got an additional 2p a day onto that. And if you got the good conduct medal, you got an additional 1p a day on top of your 2p for your 3 good conduct badges. And if you got very good in all your evaluations, you got another 1p a day. So the maximum that you could get on a Royal Navy pension in 1914 was 1 shilling and 2p per day. As I say, the minimum being 10p, so there was a 4p variation, or a 40% variation if you want to look at it from that perspective. So yeah, the good conduct medal's worth an additional 1p per day, and the only thing that an awkward officer could do to pull a man's pension would either be to arrange for him to be discharged just short of 20 years in service, but you'd have to be a very senior officer to pull that off, or to mess around with his evaluations, deny him very goods on his evaluation, deny him his good conduct awards. That wouldn't remove the pension, but it would drop the value of it. And 2 pence a day, 1 pence a day, 1 pence a day doesn't sound like all that much, but as I said, when you consider the difference between 10 pence and 1 shilling 2 pence, that's 40%. So if you took a modern pension, which might be, I don't know, 30 grand a year, if 30 grand a year is your baseline pension, just taking that as a figure out of the air as an example, then the difference between that and the maximum rate, if you're applying 1914 style calculations, would be an additional £12,000. So the difference between 30,000 and 42,000. So each of those 1 pence was worth an additional, in our example, 3 grand a year, which is a fair bit. Jack Devaney asks, in your opinion, what's the minimum tonnage that a fleet carrier needed to be a frontline aircraft carrier in World War II? Did any of the countries get it right with Rougeot, Wasp, Ranger, Centaur, or any of the other classes that come to mind? So with battleships, you've got the classic speed, protection, firepower triangle, and with most warships of the period. With aircraft carriers, I think the slight modification for fleet service is speed, anti-aircraft defence, and strike power. So anti-aircraft defence, what guns have you got aboard? And then your firepower would be, the striking power of your air group and how much ordnance they can deliver, which is usually typified by how many aircraft can you physically operate. Now, I've got an independence class here, and that's because in some ways you occasionally will see independence class referred to as light fleet carriers or light carriers, and people sometimes use the term synonymously. I think, personally, the independence class is just on the side of being a light carrier rather than a fleet carrier. And then light fleet carrier is this weird nebulous term that sits between them. Compared to other carriers, which are defined as fleet carriers, the independence class certainly has the speed. They're over 30 knots. But in terms of anti-aircraft firepower, they have no long-range heavy anti-aircraft firepower. They're just Bofors. And the flight group is around 30, just over 30. Now, that can be a bit more of a contentious one because, of course, the illustrious class are definitely fleet carriers, and in their early careers, they also operated just over 30 aircraft. So compared to, say, an illustrious, the independence class, which is 11,000 ton standard, operates, at roughly similar speeds with a roughly similar air group, and is just somewhat lacking in, using at least the triangle, just lacking in self-defense capability in terms of long-range AA. They are considerably more vulnerable to damage as well because they lack the depth of protection and armour protection of a full fleet carrier, but that's kind of a secondary thing. Now, if you look at Rougeot, she does have some long-range anti-aircraft firepower. She's just a fraction south of 30 knots, but given specifically that the Japanese Navy's carrier fleet included Kaga, that's circumstantially not as much of a problem. She's got 30 aircraft by World War II, so, kind of similar to the Independences, but she has problems because she's small with her elevators, which means it's very difficult for her to spot any particularly large strike group. So she's on the edge, but not quite, I would say, by World War II. At the time of her construction, she probably would qualify as a small fleet carrier, but not by World War II. Ranger is actually quite interesting because she does have the long-range AA firepower. She has more than enough aircraft to qualify, and although her speed is significantly below the average speed of US fleet carriers, which is separate to the average speed of Japanese carriers, she is still close enough to fast enough. So in terms of just on paper stats, Ranger, obviously at the kind of the mid tens of thousands of tons, around about 1,500 to 1,500 tons standard, is probably pushing the minimum acceptable tonnage for a fleet carrier, albeit one that is somewhat vulnerable. And, similarly with Wasps, she's got about the same speed. She's got a slightly larger theoretical air group, at least, and she's got long-range firepower. So Wasp, kind of like Ranger, meets all of the criteria for being a fleet carrier. She's just a little bit vulnerable, as she proved when she got hit. So yeah, I'd say it's somewhere in the region of 14 to 15,000 tons is the absolute minimum for a carrier that you're going to put on the front line as a fleet carrier. But that comes with the big caveat that if you do so, that carrier is going to be significantly more vulnerable to damage than a slightly larger carrier. Basically, if you go up from the sort of 14, 15,000 ton Ranger, Wasp, maybe even Colossus Majestic paradigm, what you're buying, probably going up to about 20,000 tons, is actually protection and durability, and then beyond that you start expanding other things like firepower, air group and speed. Nick Brodar asks, I know the armament of the US standard battleships varied between classes, but otherwise, how standard were the US standard battleships? It does seem to be quite funny, actually, doesn't it? Because if you take from the Nevadas to the Colorados, well, what is standard? Well, the guns aren't standard. Some have 10 guns, some have 12 guns, some have 8 guns, some have 14-inch guns, some have 16-inch guns. The 14-inch guns come in 2 different flavours. The armour is broadly the same, although depending on the source, some will claim that the Colorados have slightly more on the belt, and the exact layout and thickness of deck armour varies. The exact number and placement of the secondary battery also varies. And of course displacement and size varies. So you might be wondering, well, what is standard about them? Well, the main things that are standard about the US standard battleships is, well, excluding the Colorados, they all do have at least 14-inch guns, even if, as I said, they come in 2 separate flavours. But the main things that they were looking for, and armour is, at least in belt terms, largely standard across the class as well. The main things they were looking for, however, was standard speed, even if it came from multiple different types of propulsion, depending on the ship and depending on the class. So they will have a standard speed of 21 knots, and they have a approximately similar turning diameter, which means they can all manoeuvre together without major risk of bumping into each other. It does vary slightly. Arizona and Oklahoma, for example, despite ostensibly being sister ships to Pennsylvania and Nevada respectively, do, at least by the recorded account, seem to have very slightly different turning radii, but it was all within a margin of error that was acceptable, that made complete fleet manoeuvring entirely possible. And of course there were other things, systems of communication, certain internal layouts of things. In theory they all have cage masters as well, but then even the cage master design varies somewhat depending on the ship. And finally for this session, Wayland Chow asks, why was the diesel marine engine not more widely used during the first half of the 20th century? 3 main reasons when it comes to warships. Firstly, access to diesel fuel. Oil infrastructure really only starts to come about across the world, in the 1910s, which is part of the reason why first the US and then the Royal Navy is able to transition over to oil propulsion, because there's now an infrastructure to support people refueling. So yeah, without a widespread storage and shipment of diesel fuel, it makes taking up diesel engines somewhat more difficult. And the alternative is to have some kind of onboard distillation machinery, kind of like Graf Spee had, but that requires you to, 1, invent it, and 2, have enough space on board to fit that as well. Now, space leads into item 2. Early diesels are per square foot or per cubic foot much less power efficient compared to turbines. So if you have 2,000 square feet of steam turbine, or 2,000 cubic feet, I should say, of steam turbine, that will generate a certain amount of power. 2,000 cubic feet of diesel, prior to kind of somewhere in the early 40s, will generate less power, which means that you either make do with less power and therefore you go more slowly, or you have to deal with having much, much larger machinery spaces, which eats into space for everything else, which is obviously very annoying, and could potentially be fatal to your ship design. And then the final thing is, again, prior to the sort of the 1940s, they're actually quite unreliable. Certainly at the power ratings that you'd need for warships, they tend to break down a fair bit, which is why when you do start to see diesels being introduced into warships, initially, even as far back as World War I, they're being brought in as cruising diesels, because then you can use lower pressure, lower power units, because they only have to generate enough force to move your ship at 12, 15 knots, which doesn't require a tremendous amount of power. And the lower power, less stressed units were a bit more reliable. Plus, of course, if you've got mixed, it means that if your diesel engine gives up the ghost, you can rock over to your steam turbines and get home that way. And it's only, as I say, in the kind of the early 40s that these issues start to be overcome, and then diesel engines become more common as you get past the Second World War. The only exception to all of this is submarines, where diesels take over pretty darn quickly all the way back in the sort of the 1910s and late 1900s. That's largely down to one simple factor, which is diesels can be switched on and off, which, given that submarines need to surface, use their diesels and switch them off and dive again, is a absolutely make or break factor as compared to something like the K-class, where using steam they need quite a while to build everything up and then shut everything down again. So there's a lot of Patreon questions to answer this time round, in large part obviously because there was only the one regular dry dock in September. So let's see if I get part 2 out for Sunday. If you're listening to this, well, by the time you've reached the end of this, if the other one is available by Sunday, then it'll have already gone up. And if not, well, now you know what's happening next Sunday.